The Alps are revealing secrets that have been frozen in time for millennia, and what emerges from the melting ice is rewriting our understanding of ancient European civilization in ways that archaeologists never imagined possible. As global temperatures rise and glaciers retreat at unprecedented rates, the highest mountain passes of Europe are transforming into vast outdoor museums, where Roman soldiers once marched, where Bronze Age traders conducted business, and where prehistoric hunters pursued their prey across routes that would later become the arteries of empire. This is not merely a story of climate change, but rather a race against time itself, as scientists, archaeologists, and historians rush to document and preserve artifacts that have survived thousands of years in frozen stasis, only to face rapid deterioration the moment they are exposed to air, sunlight, and the bacteria of our modern world. What makes this phenomenon particularly extraordinary is that ice, unlike soil or water, preserves organic materials with remarkable fidelity, keeping leather supple, wood intact, and textiles nearly as vibrant as the day they were lost, creating time capsules that offer unprecedented glimpses into the daily lives, technologies, and movements of our ancestors. The story begins not with grand archaeological expeditions or systematic surveys, but with hikers, shepherds, and mountain guides who began noticing strange objects emerging from retreating ice fields in the high Alps during the early 1990s. At first, these discoveries seemed random and isolated, a shoe here, a wooden tool there, curiosities that might warrant a mention in local newspapers but little more. However, as the pace of glacial retreat accelerated through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the trickle of finds became a flood, and patterns began to emerge that would fundamentally challenge our assumptions about ancient human activity in mountain environments. Archaeologists had long believed that high mountain passes were used only sporadically, perhaps during particularly warm periods, and that permanent human presence above certain altitudes was virtually impossible before modern technology. The artifacts now emerging from the ice tell a dramatically different story, one of sustained, intensive use of these mountain corridors over thousands of years, through warm periods and cold, suggesting that ancient peoples were far more mobile, adaptable, and bold than we had credited them with being. The quantity and diversity of artifacts appearing from alpine ice fields is staggering, ranging from simple walking sticks and leather shoes to sophisticated weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial objects that speak to the passage of everyone from humble travelers to wealthy merchants and military commanders. Carbon dating of these objects has revealed continuous human activity across these mountain passes stretching back more than 6,000 years, with particularly intense periods of use during the Roman era, the medieval period, and surprisingly, during the Bronze Age, when we had assumed mountain travel would have been extremely limited due to primitive technology and harsh climatic conditions. What emerges is a picture of the Alps not as a barrier between the civilizations of Mediterranean Europe and those of the northern regions, but rather as a permeable membrane, a challenging but navigable bridge that facilitated trade, cultural exchange, military campaigns, and the movement of peoples and ideas that would shape the entire continent. The passes themselves functioned as highways in the sky, elevated corridors where travelers could move with relative freedom, avoiding the dense forests, dangerous animals, and hostile territories that made lowland travel perilous. Among the most significant categories of discoveries are the Roman military artifacts that provide unprecedented detail about how one of history's greatest empires projected power across some of Europe's most forbidding terrain. Bronze coins bearing the profiles of emperors from Augustus to Constantine, iron hobnails from military sandals called caligae, fragments of armor and weaponry, and even organic remains from military camps are painting a vivid picture of how Roman legions not only crossed these mountains but established permanent infrastructure to control them. The Romans, with their legendary engineering prowess, constructed roads through alpine passes that were marvels of ancient technology, with carefully graded switchbacks, retaining walls, drainage systems, and even heated way stations where travelers could find shelter during the worst weather. As the ice retreats, sections of these roads are appearing in remarkably good condition, with original paving stones still in place and engineering features intact after 2 millennia, testament to both Roman skill and the preservative power of ice. What is particularly fascinating is that many of these roads were not entirely new constructions but rather improvements and formalizations of routes that had been in use for thousands of years before Rome existed, suggesting that the Romans, despite their reputation for innovation, were often following in the footsteps of peoples whose names have been lost to history. The question of which route Hannibal took when he crossed the Alps with his army and war elephants in 218 BCE has been one of history's most enduring mysteries, debated by scholars since ancient times and never definitively resolved despite centuries of research and speculation. Classical sources provide frustratingly vague geographic details, describing the crossing in dramatic terms but offering little precision about exactly which passes Hannibal used on his legendary march from Iberia to Italy. Modern historians have proposed numerous candidates, including the Col de Clapia, the Col du Mont Cenis, the Col de la Traversette, and several others, with passionate arguments marshaled for and against each possibility. Now, the melting ice is providing tantalizing new evidence that may finally settle this ancient debate. In recent years, scientists have discovered unusual concentrations of organic material in ice cores taken from high-altitude passes, material that includes not just pollen and plant matter but also significant amounts of animal dung that has been dated to the exact period of Hannibal's crossing. Even more intriguing, DNA analysis of this material has revealed genetic markers consistent with North African and Iberian horse breeds, exactly the kind of cavalry mounts that would have accompanied Hannibal's army. The ice is also yielding artifacts that could plausibly be connected to military expeditions of the Hannibalic era, including weapons, tools, and personal items of styles used by Carthaginian forces and their Celtic allies. While none of these objects can be definitively proven to have belonged to Hannibal's army, the clustering of such finds in specific passes, combined with the organic evidence, is building a compelling case that is causing some historians to reconsider long-held assumptions about the route. What makes this evidence particularly valuable is that it is physical and chemical rather than textual, free from the biases, errors, and ambiguities that plague ancient written sources. The melting glacier are, in effect, providing a kind of archaeological testimony that can be cross-referenced with historical accounts to create a more complete picture. Moreover, understanding Hannibal's exact route has implications far beyond simple historical curiosity, as it illuminates Roman military strategy, ancient engineering capabilities, and the logistical possibilities of pre-modern warfare in extreme environments. Perhaps no discovery from the melting alpine ice has captured public imagination quite like Ötzi the Iceman, the remarkably preserved mummy of a man who died high in the mountains approximately 5,300 years ago and whose body was discovered by German hikers in 1991 on the border between Austria and Italy. Ötzi represents the oldest naturally preserved human mummy ever found in Europe, and his discovery sparked not only scientific interest but also diplomatic tensions, as Austrian and Italian authorities argued over which country had jurisdiction over the body and the site where it was found. Eventually, careful surveying determined that Ötzi had been found just inside Italian territory, and he now resides in a specially designed climate-controlled chamber at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, where he is maintained at the same temperature and humidity as the glacier where he spent 53 centuries. What makes Otzi so valuable to researchers is the extraordinary completeness of preservation, not just of his body but also of his clothing, equipment, and even his last meal, which was still partially present in his digestive system and has been analyzed to reveal exactly what he ate in the hours before his death. The scientific study of Otzi has revealed an astonishing amount of information about life in the Copper Age, a period about which we previously knew relatively little. His clothing was sophisticated and well adapted to mountain conditions, including a coat made of woven grass, leather leggings, a bearskin hat, and shoes with bearskin soles and deer hide uppers, stuffed with grass for insulation. His equipment included a copper axe with a yew handle, a longbow made of yew wood, a quiver containing arrows with flint points and carefully crafted feathers, and a backpack frame. He carried fire-starting equipment, including bracket fungus that could be used as tinder and flint for striking sparks. He also possessed what appears to be a first aid kit, including birch fungus that has antibacterial properties and was likely used to treat wounds or stomach ailments. Analysis of his body has revealed that he suffered from various health problems, including arthritis, whipworm infestation, probable Lyme disease, and hardened arteries that suggest he was at risk for heart disease despite his active mountain lifestyle. Perhaps most dramatically, researchers discovered an arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder and a deep cut on his hand, evidence that he died violently, probably murdered in what may have been a dispute over territory, resources, or personal grievances. The mystery of Otzi's death and the circumstances that brought him to such a remote location at over 3,000 meters elevation have inspired numerous theories and extensive research. Some scholars believe he was a shepherd who was attacked while tending his flock in high pastures. Others suggest he was a trader traveling through the mountains when he encountered enemies. Still others propose he was fleeing from pursuers after some kind of conflict in the valleys below, taking refuge in the mountains where he was eventually cornered and killed. The fact that his valuable equipment was left with his body argues against simple robbery as a motive. Recent research has focused on using advanced DNA analysis not just to understand Otzi himself but to search for living descendants who might share his genetic lineage. Scientists have extracted DNA from Otzi's bone and tissue samples and compared it with genetic databases of modern European populations, discovering that certain genetic markers he possessed are still present in contemporary populations, particularly in the Alpine regions and parts of Sardinia. While no direct descendants have been identified with certainty, the genetic connections suggest continuity of populations in these regions over thousands of years, challenging older migration theories that proposed wholesale population replacements. What makes Otzi particularly relevant to our story is that he was not alone in the high Alps during the Copper Age, and the melting ice is now revealing that his presence in such a remote location was not as unusual as we might have assumed. Dozens of artifacts from the same period have been discovered in alpine ice fields, suggesting regular traffic through these mountain passes even 5,000 years ago. These finds include leather shoes similar to Otzi's, wooden implements, rope made from plant fibers, and fragments of clothing, all pointing to sustained human activity at extreme altitudes during prehistoric times. This pattern of use appears to have continued and even intensified during the Bronze Age, roughly 3000 to 1200 BCE, when improvements in metallurgy and trade networks created increased demand for transalpine commerce. Bronze itself is an alloy of copper and tin, and these metals were often found in different regions, necessitating trade over long distances. The Alps sat astride some of the most important trade routes connecting the copper mines of the Eastern Alps with the tin sources of Western Europe, and the artifacts now emerging from the ice document this commerce in remarkable detail. Bronze Age finds from Alpine Glacier include not only tools and weapons but also luxury goods that speak to the wealth flowing through these mountain corridors. Archaeologists have recovered bronze pins, bracelets, and pendants of sophisticated design, indicating that wealthy individuals were making these crossings, perhaps merchants or aristocrats traveling to trade or establish diplomatic connections. Particularly intriguing are finds of amber, the fossilized tree resin that was highly prized in ancient times and had to be transported from the Baltic Sea region in the north to Mediterranean markets in the south. The presence of Baltic amber in alpine ice fields confirms that these mountains were part of the famous Amber Road, the prehistoric trade network that connected northern and southern Europe. Glass beads from the Near East, ivory fragments possibly from Syria or Egypt, and copper ingots from multiple sources all point to a degree of interconnectedness and economic sophistication that challenges the primitive image often associated with Bronze Age societies. The archaeological evidence emerging from the ice also reveals sophisticated knowledge of mountain environments and seasonal patterns. Many of the artifacts are found at very high elevations, above 3,000 meters, in locations that are only passable for a few months each year when snow cover is minimal. This suggests that ancient travelers had detailed knowledge of weather patterns and optimal crossing times, and that they were willing to take significant risks to save time and distance compared to lower but longer routes. Some scholars now believe that certain high passes were actually preferred routes during summer months because they were faster, offered better visibility for navigation, and were free from some lowland hazards like malaria, which was endemic in many valley regions until modern times. The artifacts themselves provide clues about seasonal use, as wooden and leather items found at the highest elevations tend to date from summer months, while finds from lower elevations span all seasons, suggesting year-round use of lower passes and summer-only use of the highest routes. As glaciers continue their retreat at accelerating rates, the urgency of archaeological work in the Alps has become critical. Unlike traditional archaeological sites where artifacts are buried in stable soil conditions, objects emerging from ice face immediate threats once exposed. Organic materials like wood, leather, and textiles begin to decompose rapidly when exposed to oxygen, moisture, and bacteria after thousands of years in frozen stasis. Sunlight causes fading and degradation. Rain and snowmelt can wash artifacts downslope, scattering them or burying them in locations where they may never be found. Wildlife may disturb or destroy exposed materials. In some cases, valuable artifacts have been trampled by livestock or collected by hikers who did not realize their archaeological significance. The window for recovering these materials in good condition is measured in years or even months for some sites, creating what archaeologists call a heritage crisis as they struggle to survey vast areas of difficult terrain with limited funding and personnel. Both Switzerland and Italy, the two countries that share the bulk of the alpine ice fields, have responded to this crisis by establishing specialized archaeological programs focused on glacial sites. The Swiss have created an inventory project that uses satellite imagery, drone surveys, and reports from mountain guides and hikers to identify areas where artifacts are likely to appear as ice retreats. When promising sites are identified, teams of archaeologists, often working in extreme conditions at high altitude, conduct systematic surveys and excavations to recover artifacts before they are lost. The Italian government has established similar programs, and the two countries cooperate on transboundary sites like the one where Otzi was found. These programs have recovered thousands of artifacts in recent decades, but researchers estimate this represents only a small fraction of what is being revealed by the melting ice, and many artifacts are undoubtedly being lost before they can be documented. The logistics of this work are daunting, as teams must be prepared for rapid deployment to remote locations, often requiring helicopter support, and must work quickly in harsh weather conditions at altitudes where oxygen levels are significantly reduced. The technological sophistication being brought to bear on this challenge is impressive, combining traditional archaeological methods with cutting-edge remote sensing and analytical techniques. Ground-penetrating radar can detect objects still buried in snow and ice, allowing archaeologists to prioritize their efforts. Drones equipped with high-resolution cameras and multispectral sensors can survey large areas quickly, identifying potential artifact locations based on color differences, thermal signatures, or other characteristics that distinguish human-made objects from natural stones and vegetation. Once artifacts are recovered, they are immediately photographed and documented in situ, then carefully packaged for transport to laboratories where they undergo detailed analysis. Carbon dating establishes chronology. DNA analysis can identify organic materials and sometimes trace their geographic origins. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth can reveal dietary patterns and geographic origins of individuals, and microscopic examination can reveal manufacturing techniques and use-wear patterns that illuminate ancient technologies and behaviors. Among all the historical mysteries that the melting alpine glacier promised to illuminate, none captures the imagination quite like the question of Hannibal Barca's legendary crossing in 218 BCE, an expedition so audacious and improbable that even ancient historians struggle to believe the accounts of survivors who witnessed it firsthand. The Carthaginian general's decision to invade Italy by marching his entire army, including dozens of war elephants, across the highest mountains in Europe during autumn remains one of military history's most debated and analyzed campaigns, not merely for its tactical brilliance but for the sheer physical achievement it represented. For more than 2,000 years, historians have argued over which passes Hannibal used, how many men and animals he lost, and whether certain details in ancient accounts should be taken literally or understood as dramatic embellishments meant to emphasize the magnitude of his accomplishment. The ancient sources themselves, primarily Polybius and Livy, provide descriptions that are simultaneously detailed and frustratingly vague, offering information about the duration of the crossing, the hardships encountered, and certain geographic features observed, but lacking the precise toponyms and coordinates that would allow modern researchers to definitively trace the route. The challenge in reconstructing Hannibal's path is compounded by the fact that the Alps themselves have changed considerably over 2 millennia, with glacier advancing and retreating, rockslides altering landscapes, and human construction modifying valleys and passes. What was passable in 218 BCE might now be blocked by ice or rock, while routes that are clear today might have been impassable then. Moreover, Hannibal's army was not traveling light but was moving thousands of soldiers, cavalry horses, pack animals, supply wagons, and those famous elephants, which meant they needed routes wide enough and stable enough to accommodate this massive logistical train. This requirement immediately rules out many passes that might be feasible for small groups of travelers but could never handle an army. Scholars have therefore focused their attention on a handful of candidate passes, each with passionate advocates who marshal evidence from ancient texts, topographic analysis, and sometimes archaeological finds to support their preferred theory. The Col du Mont Cenis, the Col de Clapier, the Col de la Traversette, and the Col du Petit Saint Bernard have all been proposed as the most likely routes, with each theory highlighting certain textual clues or geographic features that seem to match ancient descriptions. What makes the recent discoveries from melting alpine ice so potentially revolutionary for this debate is that they provide physical evidence that can be precisely dated and analyzed, offering a completely different kind of testimony than literary sources or geographic speculation. In the early 2010s, a team of microbiologists, archaeologists, and historians began a novel approach to investigating Hannibal's route, focusing not on traditional artifacts but on organic deposits preserved in ice and peat bogs near high alpine passes. Their hypothesis was elegantly simple yet methodologically sophisticated. If Hannibal's army, which ancient sources suggest numbered between 30 and 40,000 men plus thousands of horses, mules, and other animals, passed through a particular location, they would have left behind massive amounts of animal dung and other organic waste, creating a chemical and biological signature that might still be detectable 2 millennia later. The team collected ice cores and sediment samples from several candidate passes, analyzing them for unusual concentrations of organic material and using radiocarbon dating to establish when these deposits were laid down. The results were striking. At one particular high-altitude pass, they found a layer of organic material dated to precisely the period of Hannibal's crossing, containing amounts of animal fecal matter far exceeding what would be expected from normal traffic or grazing. Even more compelling, chemical analysis of this material revealed characteristics consistent with animals that had been fed on lowland vegetation from southern France and Iberia, exactly the regions through which Hannibal's army had marched before reaching the Alps. The organic deposits also contained pollen from Mediterranean plant species that don't grow in alpine environments, further supporting the interpretation that large numbers of animals from southern regions had passed through this location. DNA analysis of the preserved dung has identified genetic markers consistent with North African and Iberian horse breeds, precisely the cavalry mounts that would have accompanied Carthaginian forces. While this evidence is not absolutely conclusive by itself, when combined with geographic features described in ancient sources and the practical requirements for moving such a large force, it builds a remarkably strong case for this particular pass being part of Hannibal's route. The pass in question, the Col de la Traversette, had been previously proposed by some historians but was considered unlikely by others because of its extreme altitude and the severity of conditions there even in late summer. However, the organic evidence suggests that Hannibal may have been willing to accept extraordinary hardship to achieve tactical surprise, choosing a route so difficult that the Romans would never expect an army to attempt it. The implications of potentially solving this ancient mystery extend far beyond satisfying historical curiosity, as understanding Hannibal's exact route provides insights into ancient military logistics, the physical capabilities of pre-modern armies, and the strategic calculations that drove one of history's greatest generals. If Hannibal did indeed cross at the Col de la Traversette, it would confirm that ancient armies were capable of far more extreme endeavors than many modern historians have credited, traversing terrain at altitudes exceeding 3,000 meters with equipment and animals that seem impossibly unsuited to such conditions. It would also validate the ancient sources that describe the crossing as nearly catastrophic, with massive losses of men and animals to cold, exhaustion, and falls from narrow mountain paths. Polybius and Livy both describe scenes of chaos as animals panicked on icy slopes, wagons broke apart on rough terrain, and men succumbed to hypothermia and altitude sickness, losing perhaps a third or more of the army during the Alpine crossing. Modern military historians have sometimes dismissed these accounts as exaggerations, but if the organic evidence correctly identifies the route, then the conditions described in ancient sources would have been entirely accurate, even understated. Beyond the organic deposits, the retreating glacier are revealing artifacts that may connect to Hannibal's expedition or to the broader context of transalpine movement during the Hellenistic period. Weapons and military equipment from the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE have been found at several high passes, including iron spear points, bronze shield bosses, and hobnails from military sandals of types used by both Carthaginian forces and their Celtic allies. While none of these objects can be definitively attributed to Hannibal's army specifically, their presence confirms that significant military activity was occurring in these mountains during exactly the period in question. The concentration of such finds along certain routes provides circumstantial support for theories about which passes were most heavily traveled during ancient times. Additionally, researchers have found remains of pack animals, including horse and mule skeletons, at high altitudes where such animals would only be present if part of organized expeditions rather than casual travel. Analysis of these remains, including examination of teeth and bones for isotopic signatures that reveal where the animals were raised and what they ate, can help establish whether they came from Mediterranean regions or from more local alpine populations. The Roman response to Hannibal's invasion, and Rome's subsequent determination to control the Alpine passes to prevent any future surprise attacks from the north, transformed these mountains from natural barriers into strategically critical corridors that required permanent military presence and infrastructure. In the decades and centuries following Hannibal's crossing, Rome invested enormous resources in building roads through the Alps, establishing fortified way stations, and maintaining garrison troops to control access. The Romans understood that whoever controlled the mountain passes controlled movement between Italy and the vast territories to the north and west, territories that Rome was systematically conquering and incorporating into its expanding empire. The engineering challenges involved in building roads through such terrain were immense, requiring cuts through solid rock, the construction of retaining walls on steep slopes, drainage systems to prevent washouts, and bridges across mountain torrents. Roman military roads were built to exacting standards that allowed rapid movement of troops and supplies, with grades kept to manageable angles through use of extensive switchbacks, surfaces paved with carefully fitted stones, and width sufficient for wagons to pass each other. As alpine glacier retreat, sections of these Roman roads are appearing in remarkable states of preservation, protected for centuries under ice that prevented the erosion and damage that has destroyed or obscured most Roman roads in lower elevations. At some sites, researchers have found original paving stones still in position, with the characteristic slight crown in the center to promote drainage, fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed. Stone mile markers have been discovered, some still bearing inscriptions that record the emperor under whose reign that section was built or repaired and the distance to major cities. These inscriptions provide invaluable chronological information, allowing researchers to trace the development of the Roman road network through the Alps and to understand how different emperors prioritized and funded this infrastructure. Particularly notable are finds from the reign of Augustus, Rome's first emperor, who made securing and developing alpine communications a priority as part of his broader project of consolidating and organizing the empire's frontiers. Under Augustus, the alpine passes were transformed from difficult seasonal routes into year-round highways with heated shelters, supply depots, and military posts. The archaeological evidence emerging from the ice reveals not just the roads themselves but the entire infrastructure system that supported transalpine travel during Roman times. Researchers have discovered remains of mansions, the official rest stops that were positioned at intervals along major Roman roads, where travelers could find food, shelter, and fresh horses or pack animals. These facilities varied in size and sophistication depending on the importance of the route and the volume of traffic, ranging from simple shelters with basic provisions to substantial stone buildings with heated rooms, baths, stables, and storage facilities. At high-altitude sites, the challenge of maintaining such infrastructure was considerable, requiring systems to ensure water supply in frozen conditions, to store enough fuel and food to survive if winter storms cut off access for weeks, and to protect buildings from avalanches and extreme weather. The Romans developed sophisticated engineering solutions to these challenges, including hypercaust heating systems similar to those used in bathhouses, cisterns to collect and store snowmelt, and architectural designs that minimized snow accumulation on roofs and directed avalanches away from structures. Among the most fascinating discoveries are artifacts that illuminate the daily lives of the soldiers, officials, merchants, and travelers who used these alpine routes during Roman times. Personal items like shoes, clothing, writing materials, coins, jewelry, and religious offerings paint a vivid picture of who was crossing the mountains and why. Military equipment, including armor fragments, weapons, and the distinctive hobnailed sandals worn by Roman legionaries, documents the constant movement of troops between Italy and the northern provinces. The presence of high-status items like expensive jewelry, imported pottery, and luxury goods confirms that wealthy individuals were making these crossings, perhaps imperial officials traveling to provincial posts, merchants dealing in valuable commodities, or aristocrats visiting properties or fulfilling political obligations. Religious offerings found at high passes reveal that travelers engaged in ritual practices before attempting the dangerous crossing, leaving coins, small statues, or other votives at shrines dedicated to mountain deities or to Jupiter, the king of the gods who was believed to control weather and protect travelers. The volume of traffic documented by these artifacts is staggering and challenges assumptions about the scale of movement in the ancient world. At some passes, researchers have recovered thousands of hobnails from military sandals, suggesting that entire legions passed through these routes regularly. The variety of coin types and their wide geographic origins indicate that people from across the Roman Empire were traversing the Alps, not just locals from immediately adjacent regions. Wine amphorae from Spain, olive oil containers from North Africa, fine pottery from Gaul, and other trade goods demonstrate that commercial traffic was extensive and that the Romans had succeeded in creating an economic space that spanned the mountains despite the enormous logistical challenges. This level of integration and mobility was unprecedented in European history and would not be matched again until the modern era, making the Roman Alpine infrastructure one of the most remarkable achievements of ancient engineering and administration. The melting ice also reveals the darker aspects of Roman Alpine history, including evidence of military disasters and the human cost of maintaining empire across such unforgiving terrain. Archaeologists have discovered sites where groups of travelers apparently perished, perhaps caught in unexpected storms or avalanches, leaving clusters of artifacts and sometimes human remains that tell stories of tragedy in the high mountains. At one location, researchers found the remains of several individuals along with military equipment and coins dated to the 1st century CE, suggesting a military unit that met with catastrophe during a crossing. Another site yielded evidence of a large fire, possibly a deliberate signal fire or perhaps a desperate attempt by stranded travelers to attract rescue, surrounded by artifacts indicating that the travelers ultimately did not survive. These finds serve as sobering reminders that even the Romans, with all their engineering expertise and organizational capabilities, could not completely tame these mountains, and that travel through the Alps always carried significant risks. The comparison between Roman-era use of alpine passes and the earlier Bronze Age activity revealed by melting glacier illuminates fundamental changes in how ancient peoples approached mountain travel and infrastructure. While Bronze Age travelers certainly used these routes extensively, they did so opportunistically, following natural pathways and adapting to seasonal conditions without attempting to fundamentally reshape the landscape. The Romans, by contrast, approached the Alps as an engineering challenge to be systematically overcome, applying the same organizational and technical capabilities that built aqueducts, amphitheaters, and military fortifications throughout their empire. This shift reflects broader changes in ancient society, including the development of state-level resources that could be mobilized for major infrastructure projects, advances in engineering knowledge and construction techniques, and perhaps most fundamentally, a different conceptual relationship with nature that saw environmental challenges not as fixed constraints but as problems to be solved through human ingenuity and effort. The artifacts emerging from alpine ice also illuminate the process of cultural change and adaptation as Rome expanded northward and encountered Celtic and Germanic peoples who had their own long traditions of alpine travel and trade. Military equipment found in the mountains shows a mixing of Roman and Celtic styles, suggesting that auxiliary troops recruited from alpine regions brought their own technologies and practices to Roman service, creating hybrid military cultures. Similarly, religious offerings at high passes include both Roman gods and local deities, indicating religious syncretism as different traditions encountered and influenced each other. Trade goods show increasing standardization over time, as Roman economic dominance spread mass-produced pottery, glassware, and other commodities that gradually displaced local craft traditions, but also reveal resistance and persistence of local preferences, with certain types of Celtic jewelry and ceremonial objects continuing to be produced and used alongside Roman imports. These patterns of cultural interaction, visible in the archaeological record emerging from the ice, reflect the complex realities of imperial expansion, where military conquest was accompanied by economic integration, cultural exchange, and gradual transformation rather than simple replacement of conquered peoples. The transformation of the Alps from a formidable natural barrier into a network of engineered corridors under Roman control represents one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects of the ancient world, requiring not just technical expertise but sustained political will and enormous expenditure of resources over several centuries. The scale of this undertaking becomes truly apparent as melting glaciers reveal the extent of Roman construction at elevations that challenge even modern engineering capabilities, with roads, bridges, tunnels, and support structures built in locations where contemporary observers marvel that ancient peoples could accomplish such feats without mechanized equipment, explosives, or modern surveying instruments. What emerges from the ice is evidence of a systematic, empire-wide approach to alpine infrastructure that connected Italy with provinces in Gaul, Germania, and Britannia, facilitating not just military movements but the commerce, communication, and cultural exchange that bound together Rome's vast territorial holdings. The Romans understood intuitively what modern geopolitical theorists would later formalize, that control of transportation networks equals control of territory, and that investment in infrastructure generates returns far exceeding initial costs by enabling economic activity, military responsiveness, and administrative efficiency. The engineering principles underlying Roman alpine roads reflect sophisticated understanding of mountain environments and the specific challenges they present to construction and maintenance. Unlike roads in lowland regions where the primary concerns are drainage and durability of the surface, mountain roads must contend with extreme temperature variations that cause freeze-thaw cycles capable of shattering even the hardest stone, with slope instability that can send entire sections of road sliding downhill during heavy rains or snowmelt, with avalanches that can bury or destroy infrastructure in seconds, and with the simple logistical challenge of transporting building materials to remote high-altitude sites where every stone, every timber, and every tool must be carried up from valleys below. Roman engineers addressed these challenges through careful route selection that balanced the competing demands of minimizing gradient, avoiding avalanche zones and unstable slopes, staying below elevations where snow cover persists too long to allow reasonable seasonal access, and keeping the route as short as possible to reduce construction and maintenance costs. The solutions they developed involved extensive use of switchbacks to reduce grades, massive retaining walls to stabilize road beds on steep slopes, careful attention to drainage through construction of ditches and culverts that directed water away from the road surface, and strategic placement of way stations and shelter houses at intervals calculated to ensure that travelers could reach protection before darkness or deteriorating weather made travel impossible. Archaeological evidence emerging from retreating glacier demonstrates that Roman road construction in the Alps was not a one-time effort but rather an ongoing process of building, maintenance, upgrading, and occasional reconstruction after natural disasters. Researchers have identified multiple phases of construction at many sites, with earlier roads sometimes completely replaced by later versions that incorporated lessons learned from experience or that took advantage of improved engineering techniques and tools. Inscriptions found on milestone markers and dedication stones record repairs and improvements carried out under various emperors, creating a chronological record that spans from the late 1st century BCE under Augustus through the 4th century CE during the later empire, showing sustained investment in alpine infrastructure across centuries of Roman rule. This continuity is particularly remarkable given the political instability and economic pressures that affected Rome during much of this period, suggesting that maintaining alpine communications was considered essential to imperial survival rather than an optional luxury that could be curtailed during difficult times. The specific routes that Romans developed through the Alps reflect both strategic military considerations and economic calculations about facilitating trade between different regions of the empire. The most important passes received the most investment and development, with multiple roads sometimes built through adjacent passes to provide alternative routes in case one was blocked by weather, landslides, or enemy action. The Great St. Bernard Pass, known to the Romans as Summus Poeninus after a local deity identified with Jupiter, was one of the most heavily developed routes, connecting the Rhone Valley in what is now Switzerland with the Aosta Valley in Italy. Archaeological work at the Great St. Bernard has revealed extensive Roman infrastructure including a substantial temple complex at the summit where travelers made offerings before attempting the descent, a system of heated rest houses and stables, and elaborate engineering works to stabilize the road against avalanches and erosion. Inscriptions found at the site document visits by emperors and high-ranking officials, confirming the strategic importance Romans attached to this particular crossing. The temple complex apparently functioned not just as a religious site but as a rescue station, with priests or attendants who maintained supplies, assisted stranded travelers, and recovered bodies of those who perished attempting the crossing. The Little St. Bernard Pass, connecting the Rhone Valley with the same Italian destination by a slightly different route, received similar levels of Roman investment and was apparently preferred during certain seasons or under certain political circumstances when the Great St. Bernard was less accessible or less secure. At both passes, Romans built structures that functioned as predecessors to the medieval hospices that would later serve the same purpose, providing shelter, food, and medical assistance to travelers. The scale of these facilities, some of which could apparently accommodate hundreds of people simultaneously, speaks to the volume of traffic the Romans expected and facilitated through their alpine infrastructure. Wine storage areas, granaries, stables for dozens of animals, heated rooms with hypercourse systems, and even baths at some locations demonstrate that Romans attempted to provide not just survival shelter but a degree of comfort that would encourage continued use of these routes despite their inherent difficulties and dangers. This attention to traveler welfare was not simply humanitarian but reflected calculated understanding that maintaining commercial traffic required making the journey as safe and bearable as possible, since merchants would naturally avoid routes where risks and hardships were excessive relative to potential profits. The Brenner Pass, at the eastern end of the Alps, represented another critical link in Rome's Alpine road network, connecting Italy with the Danube frontier where Rome faced persistent military threats from Germanic and later Hunnic peoples. The Brenner's relatively low elevation and gentle gradients made it the easiest major crossing of the entire Alpine chain, and Romans invested heavily in developing this natural advantage into a military highway capable of moving legions and supplies rapidly between Italy and the northern frontier. Archaeological evidence from the Brenner includes not just road infrastructure but military installations, watchtowers, and fortified positions that document Rome's concern with defending this strategic corridor against invasion. During periods when Rome's northern frontier was under pressure, the Brenner served as a crucial supply line and reinforcement route, and several historical accounts describe major military movements through this pass. The ice now retreating from high valleys adjacent to the main Brenner route is revealing evidence of the broader pattern of Roman activity in this region, including satellite passes that served as alternative routes, military outposts positioned to provide early warning of approaching threats, and supply depots where equipment and provisions were stockpiled for emergencies. The engineering techniques Romans employed in Alpine road construction are visible in remarkable detail at sites where ice has protected structures from the weathering and damage that has obscured similar works at lower elevations. Researchers have documented the precise methods used to cut roads through solid rock, identifying tool marks that reveal the types of chisels and hammers employed and the techniques by which workers attacked stone faces to create level or gently graded passages. In locations where the natural topography made it impossible to build roads at acceptable grades, Romans constructed viaducts and elevated roadbeds, essentially building artificial ledges on which the road could run. The retaining walls supporting these constructions represent some of the most impressive stonework of the ancient world, with carefully fitted blocks weighing hundreds of kilograms each, positioned without mortar yet so precisely joined that they have survived 2,000 years of frost, erosion, and earth movement. The facing stones of these walls were often finished smooth to present an aesthetic as well as functional surface, reflecting the Roman concern with creating infrastructure that was not just utilitarian but beautiful, that proclaimed Roman power and sophistication to all who used these roads. Modern engineers who have studied Roman Alpine roads express amazement at the sophistication of drainage systems, which represent perhaps the single most critical factor in road longevity in mountain environments where water is the primary agent of destruction. Romans understood that preventing water from flowing across or along road surfaces was essential to preventing erosion and freeze-thaw damage, and they constructed elaborate networks of drains, culverts, and ditches that intercepted water from upslope sources and channeled it safely away from roadbeds. Archaeological excavations of Roman roads have revealed that these drainage systems were often more extensive than the roads themselves, with subsurface drains built into the road foundation, surface ditches running parallel to the road and regularly emptying into cross drains that carried water under the road to downslope discharge points. and in some cases sophisticated settling basins that allowed sediment-laden water to drop its load before continuing through the system, preventing accumulation that would clog drains and cause system failure. The fact that sections of these 2,000-year-old drainage systems remain functional today, still carrying water away from ancient road beds, testifies to the quality of Roman engineering and the care with which these systems were constructed and maintained. The artifacts emerging from melting alpine ice illuminate not just the physical infrastructure of Roman roads but the administrative and logistical systems required to maintain them across vast distances and difficult terrain. Inscriptions found at various locations record the activities of road maintenance departments, organized under imperial officials responsible for ensuring that routes remained passable and that facilities remained stocked and functional. These departments employed local labor for routine maintenance, hired specialized craftsmen for major repairs or improvements, maintained supply chains to ensure that remote way stations never ran short of essential provisions, and coordinated with military units that provided security and sometimes assisted with emergency repairs after natural disasters. The scale and sophistication of this administrative apparatus, documented through inscribed tablets, official seals, and correspondence preserved in dry conditions at high altitude, reveals that Romans approached alpine road maintenance with the same systematic organization they applied to other imperial functions, recognizing that infrastructure was worthless without sustained commitment to its upkeep. The economic impact of Roman alpine roads is measurable through analysis of trade goods whose geographic distribution patterns changed dramatically once reliable transalpine routes existed. Before Roman road construction, trade between Mediterranean regions and territories north of the Alps was limited by the difficulty and expense of mountain transport, with only the highest value goods justifying the costs and risks involved. Items like amber from the Baltic, tin from Britannia, and furs from Germania moved south, while Mediterranean wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods moved north, but volumes were constrained by transportation bottlenecks. Roman roads broke this bottleneck, enabling trade in goods of much lower unit value because transportation costs dropped dramatically when routes were reliable, safe, and fast. Archaeological evidence from settlements throughout the Alpine region shows increasing abundance and diversity of imported goods following road construction, with even relatively modest households gaining access to products that would previously have been unaffordable or unavailable. Wine amphorae from Spain appear in Germanic settlements hundreds of kilometers north of the Alps. Terra sigillata pottery from Gaul becomes common in Italian towns, and glass beads manufactured in Syria are found in Celtic graves in Switzerland, all testifying to the integrating effect of improved transportation. The social and cultural impacts of Roman roads extended beyond economics to reshape patterns of settlement, migration, and identity throughout alpine regions. Towns and villages grew up along major routes, with their prosperity tied to serving the needs of travelers and to participating in the expanded trade networks that roads facilitated. Local populations found employment in road maintenance, in providing services at way stations, in producing food and goods for sale to travelers, and in working as guides, porters, and translators for merchants and officials unfamiliar with mountain travel. Archaeological evidence suggests significant population movements as people from various parts of the empire settled in alpine communities, creating cosmopolitan centers where Latin mixed with Celtic and Germanic languages, where Roman and indigenous religious practices coexisted and blended, and where cultural boundaries became permeable and complex. Inscriptions from alpine settlements show personal names drawn from across the empire, marriage patterns that crossed ethnic lines, and religious dedications that honor both Roman and local deities, documenting the cultural mixing that infrastructure facilitates by enabling sustained contact between different populations. The military significance of Roman Alpine roads cannot be overstated, as these routes transformed Rome's strategic position by enabling rapid response to threats from beyond the Alps while simultaneously serving as potential invasion routes that required defensive measures. The Roman military establishment maintained permanent garrisons at strategic points along Alpine roads, not just to provide security for travelers but to ensure that Rome could close these routes to enemies if necessary. Archaeological evidence from military sites includes fortifications, signal towers that communicated using fire beacons to relay messages across long distances, weapons caches positioned for rapid deployment, and infrastructure for maintaining cavalry units that could respond quickly to incursions. Historical accounts describe several occasions when Alpine passes became battlegrounds, with invading forces attempting to force crossings while Roman defenders fought to block them, and the archaeological record confirms these literary sources through finds of weapons, armor, and sometimes mass graves containing remains of soldiers killed in combat. The strategic calculus surrounding Alpine roads was complex. Rome needed them to project power northward and to facilitate commerce, but they also represented vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies, requiring constant vigilance and substantial military investment to secure. The environmental challenges of maintaining Roman Alpine infrastructure were formidable and ultimately contributed to the decline and eventual abandonment of much of this system during the later Empire and early medieval period. As Roman administrative capacity weakened during the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, as economic contraction reduced trade volumes and therefore the tax revenues that funded road maintenance, and as military threats diverted resources and attention away from infrastructure upkeep, the Alpine road network began to deteriorate. Without constant maintenance, drainage systems clogged, leading to water damage that destroyed road surfaces. Avalanches and landslides buried sections of road that were not promptly cleared. Way stations fell into disrepair, making long-distance travel more dangerous and less attractive. The ice now retreating from Alpine passes is revealing the remains of this infrastructure collapse, with sections of road that show evidence of partial failure followed by emergency repairs, then further deterioration and eventual abandonment. At some sites, researchers can trace the process through successive phases visible in the archaeological record: well-maintained Roman road, poorly maintained road with accumulated damage, crude patches, and repairs using inferior techniques, and finally abandonment as the route became impassable and travelers found alternative paths. The contrast between Roman Alpine infrastructure at its height and the situation following Rome's collapse illustrates the vulnerability of complex technological systems to political and economic disruption. Medieval travelers through the Alps had access to far more primitive facilities than their Roman predecessors, following paths that often ran near but not on the superior Roman roads that had become impassable through neglect. The hospices established by religious orders during the Middle Ages, while performing admirable service in assisting travelers, operated at a much smaller scale and with fewer resources than the Roman way stations they replaced. Trade volumes declined, travel became more dangerous and less frequent, and the cultural and economic integration that Roman roads had facilitated gave way to regional fragmentation. It would take many centuries before European transportation infrastructure again approached Roman levels of sophistication and capability, a reminder that technological progress is not inevitable and that achievements can be lost if the social and political systems supporting them collapse. The discovery of Otzi the Iceman in September 1991 marked a watershed moment not just in Alpine archaeology but in our understanding of prehistoric European life. providing the most complete and well-preserved picture of a Copper Age individual ever found and sparking scientific investigations that continue to yield new insights more than 3 decades later. The circumstances of his discovery were almost accidental, the result of an unusually warm summer that melted snow and ice at high elevations to expose his body, which had been frozen in a glacier for 53 centuries, preserved with such remarkable fidelity that the hikers who found him initially believed they had stumbled upon the victim of a recent mountaineering accident. Only when Austrian authorities arranged for the body to be extracted from the ice and examined did experts realize they were dealing with something far more extraordinary than a modern casualty, something that would revolutionize understanding of the Copper Age and capture public imagination in ways that few archaeological discoveries ever achieve. The body was lying at an elevation of 3,210 meters in a rocky gully on the border between Austria and Italy, a location so remote and inhospitable that it raises immediate questions about what circumstances brought a lone traveler to such a place and what events led to his death in this frozen wilderness. The international attention that Otzi immediately attracted was unprecedented for an archaeological find, with media coverage rivaling that given to major political events and with scientists from dozens of institutions clamoring for access to study this unique specimen. Part of this fascination stemmed from the extraordinary preservation, which extended not just to his body but to his clothing, equipment, and even the contents of his digestive system, creating what amounts to a time capsule from the Copper Age that allows reconstruction of his final days with remarkable precision. The cold, dry conditions of the glacier had essentially freeze-dried his tissues, preventing the bacterial decomposition that normally destroys organic remains within days or weeks of death. His skin, muscles, internal organs, and even his eyes remained largely intact, though somewhat dehydrated and darkened by time. His clothing and equipment, made primarily from organic materials like leather, wood, and plant fibers that rarely survive in archaeological contexts, were preserved in conditions that allowed detailed analysis of manufacturing techniques, material sources, and functional design. Even his stomach contents remained sufficiently preserved that researchers could identify his last meals, determine when he ate them relative to the time of death, and make inferences about his activities during his final hours based on digestive state and nutritional content. The scientific investigation of Otzi has employed virtually every analytical technique available to modern archaeology and forensic science, treating the body as both an archaeological specimen providing information about Copper Age culture and technology, and as a forensic case where the goal is to reconstruct the circumstances of an individual's death. The body was transported to the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, where it resides in a specially constructed cold chamber that maintains conditions as close as possible to those of the glacier, with temperature held at -6 degrees Celsius and humidity at 98%, with periodic spraying of sterile water to prevent desiccation. Access to the body is strictly controlled and limited to brief periods when specific research projects require direct examination, with most ongoing study now conducted using non-invasive imaging techniques that allow detailed analysis without disturbing the remains. CT scans and MRI imaging have revealed internal structures, documented injuries, and identified areas of particular interest for further investigation. Three-dimensional scanning has created digital models that can be studied, measured, and analyzed without handling the actual body. DNA analysis has been performed on tissue samples, revealing genetic characteristics and allowing comparison with modern populations to search for possible descendants. The reconstruction of Otzi's physical appearance and health status has produced a detailed portrait of a Copper Age individual that challenges some previous assumptions about prehistoric life while confirming others. He was approximately 45 years old at death, relatively advanced age for the period when life expectancy was much shorter than in modern populations, suggesting he was a successful and capable individual who had survived the many hazards that claimed most people much earlier. He stood approximately 160 centimeters tall, shorter than modern Europeans but within normal range for Copper Age populations whose stature was limited by nutritional factors and genetic characteristics that have changed over millennia. His build was lean and muscular, with body composition suggesting regular physical activity and a life spent largely outdoors engaged in demanding work. His hands showed calluses and wear patterns consistent with using tools and weapons, while his legs and feet bore evidence of extensive walking over rough terrain. His teeth were heavily worn, showing the effects of a diet that included coarse ground grains containing stone particles from grinding mills, a pattern seen in many prehistoric skeletons from agricultural societies. The health problems that Otzi suffered from paint a picture of the diseases and conditions that afflicted prehistoric peoples, many of which remain common today despite dramatic changes in lifestyle and environment. He had significant arthritis in his joints, particularly in his spine, hips, and knees, causing chronic pain that he apparently attempted to treat through a form of primitive acupuncture or therapeutic tattooing, as evidenced by more than 60 tattoos found on his body, many located at points corresponding to areas of joint degeneration and positioned at locations that traditional Chinese medicine would identify as acupuncture points, suggesting possible independent discovery of similar therapeutic concepts. He suffered from intestinal parasites, specifically whipworm, a common affliction in populations with poor sanitation and close contact with domestic animals. Analysis of his arterial walls revealed significant calcification, indicating advanced atherosclerosis that would have put him at risk for heart attack or stroke, making him what may be the oldest known case of cardiovascular disease documented in human remains. His teeth showed evidence of periodontal disease, with inflammation and recession of gum tissue that must have caused discomfort and may have contributed to systemic health problems. He likely suffered from Lyme disease, as DNA from the Borrelia bacteria that causes this condition was detected in his tissues, representing the earliest known case of this now common tick-borne illness. The analysis of Otzi's last meals has provided extraordinarily detailed information about Copper Age diet and food preparation techniques, offering insights that would be impossible to obtain from settlement archaeology or other conventional sources. Examination of his stomach and intestinal contents revealed that he had eaten 2 substantial meals in the 8 hours before his death, with the composition and digestion state of these meals allowing researchers to reconstruct a surprisingly detailed timeline of his final day. His last meal, eaten perhaps an hour or 2 before death, consisted of ibex meat and fat, along with some grain, possibly in the form of bread, and what appears to be bracken fern, which may have been used as a food wrapper or may have had medicinal purposes. The meal before that, eaten perhaps 6 to 8 hours prior to death, consisted of red deer meat, also with grain and various plant materials. The presence of both ibex and red deer, which occupy different ecological zones with ibex preferring higher elevations and deer found in forested lower areas, suggests that Otzi had been moving through varied terrain during his final day or days, perhaps ascending from lower valleys toward the high pass where he ultimately died. The pollen grains found in his digestive system and preserved in his clothing provide additional clues about his movements and the season of his death, as different plant species release pollen at specific times of year and in specific geographic zones. Analysis identified pollen from hop hornbeam, a tree that grows at relatively low elevations in the valleys south of the Alps, along with pollen from spruce and pine that characterize middle elevations, and pollen from high-altitude plants found only near treeline and above, confirming that Otzi had indeed traveled from low to high elevations shortly before his death. The presence of fresh pollen from spring-blooming plants indicates that his death occurred in late spring or early summer, when the pass would have been newly accessible after winter snows melted, but when conditions at high altitude would still have been cold and potentially dangerous. This seasonal timing raises questions about why he was making this crossing at this particular time, whether he was following some regular schedule related to seasonal activities like transhumance or trade, or whether he was fleeing from some threat and attempting to cross the mountains at the earliest possible date regardless of lingering hazards. The equipment that Otzi carried provides a comprehensive picture of Copper Age technology and the practical gear required for mountain travel in prehistoric times, with each item revealing sophisticated understanding of materials and manufacturing techniques. His most famous possession, the copper axe, represents a transitional technology between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, with a blade of nearly pure copper hafted to a U-wood handle using birch tar adhesive and leather bindings, the entire assembly representing hours of skilled craft work and demonstrating knowledge of metallurgy, woodworking, and adhesive chemistry. The copper for the blade was smelted from ore, a process requiring sustained high temperatures achievable only in specially constructed furnaces, then shaped through a combination of casting and cold hammering that work-hardened the metal to improve its edge-holding capability. Chemical analysis of the copper revealed that the ore came from deposits in the eastern Alps, hundreds of kilometers from where Otzi died, indicating either long-distance trade in metal or extensive personal travels, and suggesting that copper was valuable enough to warrant transport over considerable distances. The axe itself was not a utilitarian tool but rather a prestige object, too valuable to use for routine woodcutting or other heavy work, instead serving as a status symbol and perhaps a weapon, marking Otzi as a person of some standing in his community. His bow, made from yew wood, was unfinished at the time of his death, roughly shaped but not yet refined to its final form and lacking a string, suggesting either that Otzi was in the process of making a new bow to replace a broken one or that he was carrying a bow blank as a trade good. Yew was the preferred wood for bows throughout European prehistory and into medieval times because of its unique combination of properties, with the dark heartwood providing compression strength and the pale sapwood providing tension strength, allowing a well-made yew bow to store and release energy with remarkable efficiency. The fact that Otzi was carrying yew wood, even in unfinished form, indicates knowledge of these specialized properties and access to yew trees, which grew in specific ecological zones and were sufficiently valuable that people transported them considerable distances. His quiver contained 14 arrows, but only 2 were finished with flint points and feather fletching, while the others were merely shaped wooden shafts lacking the points and guidance surfaces needed for effective use, again suggesting either that Otzi was in the process of manufacturing arrows or had recently expended most of his finished arrows and not yet had time or opportunity to make replacements. The arrows themselves demonstrate sophisticated understanding of projectile dynamics and aeronautics, with the feather fletching carefully attached using a combination of birch tar adhesive and fine thread binding, positioned at the rear of the shaft to provide spin stabilization during flight, exactly as modern arrows are designed. The flint points were attached to the wooden shafts using birch tar and sinew binding, with the shafts grooved at the rear to accept a bowstring, a design feature that improves release consistency and accuracy. The fact that only 2 of 14 arrows were complete raises intriguing questions about what had happened to Otzi's other arrows, whether he had used them hunting or in combat, whether they had been lost or damaged during his travels, or whether he had traded them away and had not yet manufactured replacements. The presence of arrow-making materials in his equipment, including spare flint points and materials for hafting and fletching, confirms that Otzi possessed the skills and materials to manufacture arrows and was planning to complete the unfinished shafts, suggesting that whatever circumstances brought him to the high pass interrupted this work. His clothing, preserved with remarkable completeness, reveals sophisticated understanding of insulation, weatherproofing, and the properties of different animal hides and plant materials. He wore a coat woven from grass, specifically bunch grass, creating a rain-shedding outer layer similar to the thatched roofs used on buildings, with the overlapping grass stems directing water away from the body. Under this was a leather coat made from strips of goat and sheep hide sewn together, providing insulation while remaining flexible enough for comfortable movement. His leggings were also made from goat leather, designed to be worn separately rather than as joined trousers, allowing greater ventilation and easier repair or replacement of damaged sections. His shoes were particularly sophisticated, consisting of bearskin soles that provided durability and traction, deer hide uppers that offered water resistance, and a grass lining that provided insulation, with the entire assembly held together by a leather webbing system that distributed pressure evenly and could be tightened or loosened to accommodate different terrain and snow conditions. Modern experimental archaeologists who have recreated and tested Otzi's shoes report that they provide excellent comfort and protection for mountain travel, comparing favorably to modern hiking boots for certain conditions and terrain types. His accessories included a belt pouch containing a variety of tools and materials that might be characterized as survival gear, including a drill for making fire by friction, multiple flint blades for cutting and scraping, a bone awl for punching holes in leather, and several types of fungus with known medicinal or practical properties. One fungus, true tinder parley paw, was an excellent fire-starting material when dried, capable of holding a coal for hours and easily ignited from sparks produced by striking flint against iron pyrite. Another fungus, birch parley paw, has antibacterial properties and was apparently used medicinally to treat various ailments, with Otzi carrying two pieces threaded on a leather cord as if worn as a necklace or attached to clothing for ready access. He also carried birch tar, a sticky substance produced by heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen, which served as a waterproof adhesive capable of bonding stone points to wooden shafts, repairing torn leather, and numerous other applications, making it a kind of prehistoric superglue that was valuable and labor-intensive to produce. The mystery of Otzi's death remained unresolved for years after his discovery, with early theories suggesting he might have died from exposure after becoming lost or trapped by sudden weather changes, a not uncommon fate for mountain travelers even today. However, in 2001, a decade after the body's discovery, new CT scans revealed an arrowhead embedded in his left shoulder, positioned in a way that would have severed major blood vessels and caused rapid death from hemorrhaging, transforming Otzi from a victim of environmental misfortune into a murder victim and raising entirely new questions about who killed him and why. Additional evidence of violence emerged from examination of his right hand, which showed a deep cut that had occurred a day or two before death and had begun healing, suggesting Otzi had been involved in combat or violent conflict shortly before the events that killed him. The presence of blood from 4 different individuals on his clothing and equipment, identified through DNA analysis, indicates that Otzi had either been involved in multiple violent encounters or had participated in combat involving several people, with some of this blood appearing to be on his arrows and knife, suggesting he had injured or killed others, while additional blood was on his coat, suggesting he had carried or assisted wounded companions. The revelation that Otzi had been murdered, combined with the evidence of multiple violent encounters in his final days, transformed the scientific investigation from a study of Copper Age material culture into something more akin to a cold case murder investigation, with researchers attempting to reconstruct the events leading to his death and to understand the social context that made such violence possible or even commonplace in prehistoric alpine communities. The various scenarios proposed to explain these findings range from blood feuds between rival groups, to territorial disputes over valuable resources like copper deposits or hunting grounds, to conflicts over trade routes and the valuable goods moving through mountain passes. Some researchers suggest that Otzi might have been a trader or merchant who fell victim to robbery, with attackers killing him to steal valuable items he was transporting, though this theory is complicated by the fact that his copper axe and other valuable possessions were left with his body rather than being taken by whoever killed him. Others propose that he was involved in raiding or warfare between communities, perhaps as a warrior or military leader, and that his death represented retaliation for attacks he had participated in against rival groups, with the blood evidence indicating that he had indeed been involved in violent actions against others. The location where Otzi died, high in the mountains far from any settlement, suggests that he was either fleeing from pursuers or attempting to escape some threat in the valleys below, choosing a dangerous mountain crossing as the lesser of two evils compared to remaining in more accessible terrain where enemies could find him. The presence of his equipment and the fact that he had recently eaten substantial meals indicate that his flight was not desperate panic but rather a calculated retreat, moving quickly but with sufficient organization to maintain possession of his gear and to stop for food and rest. However, the unfinished state of his bow and arrows suggests that he was inadequately prepared for combat, either because events had moved too quickly for him to complete necessary preparations or because he had recently expended most of his ammunition in fighting and had not yet had opportunity to manufacture replacements. The arrow wound that killed him struck from behind and below, suggesting that his attacker was pursuing him uphill, perhaps as he attempted to crest the pass and descend to safety on the opposite side, catching him just short of escape. The complete picture that emerges from all the evidence is of a man in his mid-40s, a person of some status in his community as indicated by his copper axe and other possessions, who became involved in violent conflict involving multiple individuals, sustained a hand wound in fighting a day or two before his death, then fled into the mountains with pursuers following, ate his final meals while moving through varied terrain ascending toward a high pass, and was shot from behind with an arrow. That caused his death within minutes from catastrophic bleeding. He fell or lay down in a sheltered rocky gully, perhaps attempting to find protection or perhaps already dying from his wound, and was quickly covered by snow that transformed into glacial ice, preserving him for 53 centuries until climatic warming exposed his body to modern discovery. This narrative, reconstructed from physical evidence using forensic techniques that Otzi's contemporaries could never have imagined, provides an unusually intimate glimpse into the violence and danger that characterized prehistoric life, reminding us that ancient peoples faced many of the same interpersonal conflicts and social tensions that trouble modern societies, resolved through violence in the absence of effective judicial systems or law enforcement. The scientific investigation of Otzi has extended beyond his physical remains and possessions to encompass genetic analysis aimed at understanding his ancestry, identifying possible living descendants, and placing him within the broader context of prehistoric European population movements and genetic evolution. DNA extracted from his bones and tissues has been sequenced and compared with genetic databases of ancient and modern populations, revealing that he belonged to genetic lineages that are now relatively rare in Europe but that were apparently more common during the Copper Age. His Y chromosome haplogroup, inherited through his paternal line, belongs to group G2A, which is found in modern populations at frequencies ranging from less than 1% in most of Europe to higher percentages in certain Mediterranean islands, particularly Sardinia and Corsica, and in some isolated mountain communities in the Caucasus region. This distribution suggests that G2A was once much more common throughout Europe but was largely replaced by other lineages associated with subsequent population movements, particularly the arrival of Indo-European-speaking peoples during the Bronze Age, who introduced new genetic lineages including R1A and R1B that now dominate European populations. The mitochondrial DNA that Otzi inherited through his maternal line belongs to haplogroup K1, which is fairly common in modern European populations at frequencies ranging from 5 to 10%, though the specific subtype he carried, K1F, is much rarer and has been found in few modern individuals. The genetic evidence suggests that Otzi's maternal lineage has survived in modern populations while his paternal lineage has become much less common, a pattern that could reflect various historical processes including sex-biased migration where incoming groups consisted primarily of males who married local women, warfare that disproportionately killed males of existing populations, or simply genetic drift and random variation over thousands of years. The search for living descendants who might carry Otzi's Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA has produced intriguing but inconclusive results, with several individuals identified who carry similar but not identical genetic markers, suggesting possible distant relationship but not direct descent. The residents of the Otstal Valley, the region where Otzi likely lived before his death, have been tested extensively, with some individuals showing genetic similarities that suggest possible connection, though establishing definitive descent after 53 centuries requires more precision than current genetic techniques can provide. Beyond the search for specific descendants, the genetic analysis of Otzi has contributed to broader understanding of prehistoric European population structure and the genetic changes that have occurred over millennia of migration, mixing, and selection. Comparison with DNA extracted from other ancient remains has revealed that Copper Age populations like the one Otzi belong to were genetically distinct from both earlier hunter-gatherer populations and from the Bronze Age populations that succeeded them, representing a period when early farming communities were spreading across Europe, displacing or absorbing hunter-gatherers but themselves destined to be transformed by subsequent arrivals. The genetic evidence suggests that these early farmers originated in the Near East and Anatolia, spreading into Europe beginning around 7000 BCE and bringing with them agricultural technologies, domesticated plants and animals, and new social organizations based on settled village life rather than mobile hunting and gathering. By Otzi's time, these farming populations had occupied European landscapes for several thousand years, adapting to local conditions and developing regional cultural variations while maintaining genetic connections that linked communities across vast distances. The revelations about Otzi's health problems and genetic characteristics have medical as well as historical significance, as they document the antiquity of diseases that remain major health challenges today and provide evidence about human genetic adaptation to environmental conditions and dietary patterns. The cardiovascular disease evident in his arterial walls demonstrates that atherosclerosis is not purely a disease of modern lifestyle, though diet, exercise, and other factors certainly influence its severity and prevalence. The presence of this condition in a man who was physically active, lean, and living on what would generally be considered a healthy diet by modern standards suggests that genetic factors play significant roles in cardiovascular risk, an important consideration for modern medicine's emphasis on lifestyle modification as disease prevention. Similarly, the Lyme disease bacteria found in his tissues confirm that this tick-borne infection has affected human populations for at least 5,000 years, long before the habitat modifications and climate change is often blamed for its recent spread, suggesting that historical baseline prevalence may have been higher than previously recognized. The artifacts emerging from melting alpine glacier in locations near where Otzi was found provide context for understanding his life and travels, revealing that the high mountain environments where he died were not empty wilderness but rather frequently traversed corridors connecting communities on opposite sides of the Alps. Bronze Age and Copper Age artifacts discovered in recent years include tools, weapons, ornaments, and domestic items that document continuous human activity in these mountains spanning thousands of years before and after Otzi's time. Particularly significant are finds of objects that indicate trade and exchange networks connecting distant regions, including materials like obsidian volcanic glass from Mediterranean islands, Baltic amber from the far north, and copper from various alpine mining regions, all found in contexts that demonstrate they were being transported across the mountains as trade goods. These finds confirm that the transalpine trade routes that would later be formalized as Roman roads had prehistoric origins stretching back into the depths of the Stone Age, suggesting that human communities have always sought to exchange goods, ideas, and genetic material across geographic barriers despite the difficulties and dangers involved. The metallurgical artifacts from the Bronze Age that continue to appear from retreating ice fields represent particularly valuable evidence about technological development and trade networks during a crucial period when metal tools and weapons were transforming human societies across Europe and the Mediterranean. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, offered dramatic advantages over pure copper or stone for making tools and weapons, as it was harder, held edges better, and could be cast into complex shapes, but required access to both copper and tin, metals that rarely occur together in nature. This geographic separation of necessary resources created economic incentives for long-distance trade and political incentives for controlling access to metal sources, with Bronze Age societies organizing military expeditions to secure mining regions and establishing trade networks that spanned entire continents. The Alpine region was particularly important in these networks because of its rich copper deposits and its position connecting northern and southern Europe, making control of mountain passes strategically valuable for any group seeking to profit from metallurgical trade. The bronze weapons and tools found in alpine ice include axes, daggers, spearheads, and various specialized implements whose forms evolved over the roughly 2,000-year duration of the Bronze Age, providing chronological markers that help archaeologists date other associated finds and understand patterns of use for different passes during different periods. Early Bronze Age axes from around 2000 BCE show relatively simple forms with flat or slightly flanged blades, while later examples from 1500 to 1000 BCE exhibit more sophisticated socket designs that provided stronger, more durable hafting to wooden handles. Daggers follow similar evolutionary patterns, beginning as simple flat blades with riveted handles and developing into more complex forms with cast hilts, decorative elements, and sophisticated metallurgical techniques visible in their composition and manufacturing traces. The distribution patterns of these objects across different passes and at different elevations provide clues about which routes were preferred during which periods, with some passes showing concentrations of early Bronze Age material while others yield primarily later Bronze Age finds, suggesting shifts in trade routes responding to political changes, climate variations, or discoveries of new mineral resources. Among the most intriguing Bronze Age discoveries are ornamental objects including jewelry, decorative pins, and ritual items that speak to the wealth and cultural sophistication of the people traversing these mountain passes. Bronze pins used to fasten clothing range from simple utilitarian designs to elaborate examples with decorative heads shaped as spirals, wheels, or animal figures, demonstrating both technical skill in casting complex forms and aesthetic sensibilities that valued beauty as well as function. These pins serve as cultural markers, with specific styles associated with particular regions and time periods, allowing archaeologists to trace connections between distant communities and to identify possible origins of travelers who lost or discarded objects in the mountains. A pin of a type common in northern Italy found in a Swiss pass might indicate a merchant traveling from south to north, while a pin of Central European style found in an Italian valley suggests movement in the opposite direction, creating a map of Bronze Age mobility built from accumulated individual artifacts. Bronze Age jewelry including bracelets, torques, and pendant decorations reveals both the personal wealth of some mountain travelers and the existence of specialized craftspeople capable of producing luxury goods for elite consumers. Some pieces show evidence of long use, with wear patterns indicating they were treasured possessions worn regularly over years or even decades before being lost in the mountains, perhaps representing the entire wealth of an individual who perished attempting a crossing. Other pieces appear nearly new, possibly trade goods being transported from production centers to distant markets, or diplomatic gifts being carried between allied chieftains. The presence of such valuable objects in remote high-altitude locations where they provide no obvious utility raises questions about why people carried them on dangerous mountain journeys rather than leaving them safely at home, with possible explanations ranging from necessity if the traveler's entire wealth was portable, to display of status even in challenging circumstances, to superstitious beliefs that certain ornaments provided protection or good fortune during travels. The organic artifacts from the Bronze Age that glacial ice has preserved provide information about aspects of Bronze Age life that would otherwise be lost, as textiles, leather goods, wooden implements, and other perishable materials rarely survive in normal archaeological contexts. Fragments of clothing found in alpine ice include woven wool textiles demonstrating sophisticated spinning and weaving techniques, leather garments sewn with careful stitching, and occasional fragments of other materials including linen and plant fiber cords. The weaving patterns visible in textile fragments reveal that Bronze Age weavers could produce fabrics ranging from coarse utilitarian cloth to fine complex weaves suitable for clothing wealthy individuals, with some examples showing decorative patterns created through varied thread colors or weaving techniques. Leather working reached high levels of sophistication, with finds including shoes, bags, straps, and garment pieces that demonstrate knowledge of different tanning methods producing materials with varied properties of flexibility, water resistance, and durability appropriate to different uses. Wooden artifacts from the Bronze Age found in ice include tool handles, structural elements from pack frames or shelters, and occasionally complete implements like bows, arrows, and walking sticks that provide direct evidence of technologies that must otherwise be inferred from indirect sources. Wooden bowl and container fragments reveal that Bronze Age peoples carved domestic items from solid wood, creating functional objects that were nevertheless finished with care and sometimes decorated with carved or burned designs. Walking sticks and staffs, found in considerable numbers at high passes, suggest that Bronze Age mountain travelers used aids similar to modern trekking poles to maintain balance and reduce strain during climbs, with some examples showing wear patterns indicating years of heavy use. The wood species selected for different purposes reveal sophisticated understanding of material properties, with hard dense woods like oak or ash chosen for tool handles requiring strength and impact resistance, while more flexible woods like willow or hazel were used for items needing resilience and spring, demonstrating that Bronze Age craftspeople matched materials to applications as carefully as modern engineers. The accelerating pace of glacial retreat across the Alps has created what archaeologists describe as a crisis of unprecedented proportions, where thousands of years of human history are simultaneously being revealed and placed at immediate risk of destruction, forcing researchers to make difficult decisions about where to focus limited resources and how to prioritize among competing demands for documentation and recovery. The fundamental problem is one of scale and speed. Glaciers that required millennia to form are disappearing in decades, exposing archaeological materials across vast areas of difficult mountain terrain, while the artifacts themselves begin deteriorating the moment they emerge from protective ice, creating a window of opportunity measured in seasons or even months before irreplaceable evidence is lost forever. This situation has forced a complete rethinking of traditional archaeological methods, which typically involve careful systematic excavation of specific sites over periods of years, as the sheer extent of areas requiring attention and the urgency of time constraints make such leisurely approaches impossible. Instead, archaeologists working in alpine glacial contexts have developed rapid assessment protocols, triage systems for prioritizing interventions, and collaborative networks that mobilize resources quickly when significant discoveries are reported. The Swiss and Italian governments, which control the majority of alpine glacial terrain, have responded to this archaeological emergency by establishing specialized programs that coordinate glacier monitoring, artifact recovery, and preservation efforts across their respective territories. The Swiss Archaeological Service created the Glacial Archaeology project in the early 2000s, initially as a small pilot program but expanding dramatically as the scope of discoveries became apparent, now involving dozens of archaeologists, conservators, and support staff working during the brief alpine summer season when high-altitude sites are accessible. The program operates through a network of partnerships with mountain guides, ski patrol personnel, hiking clubs, and tourism operators who are trained to recognize potential archaeological materials and report finds through a centralized system that allows rapid response. When reports come in describing possible artifacts emerging from ice, assessment teams equipped for rapid deployment via helicopter can reach remote sites within hours, documenting finds through photography and GPS positioning, making preliminary assessments of significance and vulnerability, and when warranted, conducting emergency recovery operations to secure materials before they deteriorate or are lost to weather, wildlife, or human interference. The Italian authorities have established similar programs coordinated through regional archaeological offices, with particular focus on the South Tyrol region where Otzi was found and where glacial retreat continues to reveal new sites. The Italian approach emphasizes collaboration with local communities, recognizing that people who live and work in mountain regions year-round have knowledge of terrain, weather patterns, and environmental changes that outside experts cannot match, and that engaging local support is essential both practically and ethically. Mountain guides who lead commercial hiking and climbing expeditions receive training in recognizing archaeological materials and documenting their locations, becoming in effect a distributed network of observers covering vast areas that professional archaeologists could never systematically patrol. Shepherds who move flocks to high pastures during summer months, ski lift operators who traverse mountain terrain regularly, and mountain refuge managers who interact with hikers and climbers reporting unusual finds all participate in an informal surveillance network that has proven remarkably effective at identifying new archaeological sites before materials are lost. The challenges of documenting and recovering artifacts from high-altitude glacial environments are formidable, combining the technical difficulties of archaeological fieldwork with the physical demands and dangers of mountaineering in environments where weather can change rapidly, where altitude affects physical and cognitive performance, and where even minor injuries or equipment failures can become life-threatening emergencies. Archaeological teams working at elevations above 3,000 meters must acclimatize to reduced oxygen levels that cause fatigue, impaired judgment, and slow physical performance, making tasks that would be straightforward at lower elevations exhausting and time-consuming. The cold temperatures typical of high-altitude sites even during summer require specialized clothing and equipment to prevent hypothermia, while also complicating documentation procedures as cameras, GPS units, and other electronic equipment malfunction in extreme cold. The remote locations of most sites require helicopter support for personnel and equipment transport, as hiking to sites carrying necessary archaeological tools, documentation equipment, and protective materials for artifacts would consume days of time that teams working in brief weather windows cannot spare. Weather represents perhaps the most critical limiting factor for high-altitude archaeological work, as conditions in alpine environments can shift from clear and calm to dangerously stormy within hours, stranding teams on exposed ridges or forcing evacuation before work is complete. Summer thunderstorms, common in mountain regions during afternoon hours, bring not just rain that can damage exposed artifacts but lightning that poses serious danger to people working on exposed terrain with metal equipment. Snow can fall at high elevations during any month, covering sites and making further work impossible until conditions improve, while also placing additional weight on artifacts already emerging from ice, potentially crushing fragile materials or burying them under new accumulations. High winds, which frequently affect mountain passes and ridges, make helicopter operations dangerous or impossible, can blow lightweight materials like textiles and leather away from discovery sites before they can be secured, and create wind chill conditions that dramatically increase risk of cold-related injuries to personnel. These weather constraints mean that high-altitude archaeological work must proceed with constant awareness of forecast conditions, with contingency plans for rapid withdrawal if weather deteriorates, and with acceptance that many operations will be interrupted or cancelled due to environmental factors beyond human control. The protocols developed for recovering artifacts from glacial ice reflect hard-won experience about what works in these extreme environments and what approaches lead to damage or loss of materials. When organic artifacts like leather, wood, or textile emerge from ice after thousands of years, they are often saturated with water and extremely fragile, requiring immediate stabilization to prevent cracking, warping, or collapse as materials dry. Field teams carry specialized packaging materials including foam supports, plastic wrapping, and insulated containers that maintain cold, humid conditions during transport, essentially extending the glacial preservation environment until artifacts can reach laboratory facilities equipped for long-term conservation. Photographs and detailed notes document exact positions and contexts before anything is moved, as spatial relationships between artifacts can provide crucial information about how materials were deposited and what activities occurred at the site. GPS coordinates recorded with professional-grade accuracy allow sites to be relocated for follow-up work and enable mapping of artifact distributions across broad areas, revealing patterns that illuminate ancient travel routes and activity zones. When artifacts cannot be immediately recovered due to logistical constraints or weather conditions, teams must make difficult decisions about whether materials can be left in situ until return visits or whether decomposition will occur too rapidly to permit delays. Organic materials exposed to air and fluctuating temperatures deteriorate much faster than the same materials remaining in ice, with leather and textiles particularly vulnerable to bacterial and fungal growth that can destroy them within a single summer season. Wooden artifacts are somewhat more resistant but still suffer from checking and splitting as they dry, while metal objects are relatively stable in the short term but can corrode if subject to repeated wetting and drying cycles. These differential preservation rates force prioritization decisions where teams must choose which materials to recover immediately and which can wait, balancing ideal archaeological practice of systematic excavation against practical constraints of time, resources, and artifact vulnerability. The general principle has become that organic materials take absolute priority for immediate recovery, while stone and metal artifacts, though also important, can tolerate delays without catastrophic loss. The logistics of helicopter operations in high mountain environments adds another layer of complexity and expense to glacial archaeological work, as aircraft capable of operating at extreme altitudes with the payload capacity needed for personnel and equipment are specialized and expensive, while pilots qualified for high-altitude mountain work are relatively rare. Helicopters must contend with reduced air density at altitude that diminishes lift and engine performance, requiring larger, more powerful aircraft than would be needed for the same missions at lower elevations. Landing sites at archaeological locations are often improvised, lacking prepared pads or ground support, requiring pilots to assess terrain stability and wind conditions while maneuvering in confined spaces where margin for error is minimal. Weight restrictions become critical concerns, with teams carefully calculating loads to ensure aircraft can safely operate, often meaning that equipment must be prioritized and multiple flights are needed to transport everything required for complex operations. The cost of helicopter time, typically hundreds or thousands of dollars per flight hour, represents a significant portion of glacial archaeology program budgets, creating constant pressure to use aircraft time efficiently and to combine missions when possible to reduce total flying hours. The preservation and analysis of artifacts recovered from alpine ice requires specialized laboratory facilities and conservation expertise rarely needed for materials from conventional archaeological sites, as objects that have been frozen for millennia require different treatment than objects that have been buried in soil or submerged in water. The transition from frozen to room temperature conditions must be controlled carefully to prevent thermal shock that can crack or shatter fragile materials, with protocols typically calling for gradual warming over days or weeks rather than rapid exposure to ambient temperatures. Organic materials saturated with water must be kept wet during conservation to prevent shrinkage and distortion, with various techniques used depending on material type and condition, including freeze-drying that removes water while maintaining original dimensions, or chemical stabilization using polymers that replace water molecules and provide structural support. Metals recovered from ice may be relatively uncorroded but still require conservation to prevent deterioration once exposed to oxygen and humidity, with techniques ranging from simple cleaning to remove dirt and stabilize surfaces, to more complex interventions for severely corroded objects that require electrochemical treatment. The analytical work conducted on artifacts from alpine ice extends far beyond traditional archaeological approaches of classifying objects by type and style, instead employing sophisticated scientific techniques that extract maximum information from these rare and precious materials. Radiocarbon dating establishes chronology with precision impossible from stylistic analysis alone, allowing researchers to document patterns of human activity through time and to correlate archaeological evidence with paleoclimatic data about temperature and precipitation variations. DNA analysis of organic materials identifies species used for leather and other animal products, sometimes revealing use of exotic species that must have been obtained through long-distance trade, and occasionally preserving genetic information about domestic animal breeds that can be compared with modern populations to trace agricultural evolution. Isotopic analysis of bones, teeth, and organic residues provides information about diet, geographic origins of individuals, and environmental conditions during the time when biological materials formed, with different isotopes revealing different aspects of ancient life and creating composite pictures of remarkable detail and complexity. The microscopic examination of manufacturing traces on artifacts reveals technical knowledge and skill levels of ancient craftspeople, documenting production methods that leave characteristic patterns visible to trained observers using magnification and specialized lighting. Stone tools show flaking patterns that identify knapping techniques and skill levels of individuals who made them, while metal artifacts preserve traces of casting, hammering, and finishing processes that illuminate metallurgical knowledge. Textile fragments examined under microscopy reveal thread counts, weaving patterns, and sometimes even the direction of spin used in creating yarn, details that help identify production regions and cultural affiliations. Wear patterns on tools and clothing show how objects were used, documenting activities and behaviors that might otherwise remain invisible, with experimental archaeology providing comparative data by using replica tools and recording how different activities create distinctive wear signatures. The combination of these various analytical approaches transforms individual artifacts into rich sources of information about technology, economy, social organization, and cultural practices of prehistoric peoples. The data emerging from glacial archaeology in the Alps has begun to reshape scholarly understanding of prehistoric European societies in fundamental ways, challenging long-held assumptions about population mobility, economic complexity, and the capabilities of peoples lacking written records or many technologies we consider essential. The sheer volume of transalpine traffic documented through artifact accumulations demonstrates that mountain barriers were not nearly as isolating as previously believed, and that prehistoric peoples routinely crossed formidable terrain to maintain trade connections, social relationships, and political alliances spanning hundreds of kilometers. The sophistication of equipment and the evidence for specialized knowledge about mountain environments revealed through finds like Otz's gear shows that ancient peoples developed expertise comparable to modern mountaineers in reading terrain, predicting weather, and preparing for hazards, accomplishing with simple tools and materials what we now achieve with advanced technology. The continuous use of specific passes over thousands of years documented through artifact chronologies demonstrates that cultural knowledge about routes and travel techniques was successfully transmitted across generations, creating traditions of mountain travel that persisted despite periodic population changes and cultural transformations. The economic implications of glacial archaeological finds are particularly significant, as they document exchange networks of remarkable extent and complexity during periods when conventional models suggested limited trade and local self-sufficiency should have prevailed. The presence of materials from Mediterranean sources in northern European contexts and vice versa, all passing through alpine corridors, proves that Bronze Age and even earlier economies involved regular long-distance commerce in diverse commodities. Copper, tin, amber, salt, fine textiles, and probably many organic products like furs, honey, and preserved foods moved through these mountain routes in quantities sufficient to leave archaeological traces despite thousands of years of post-depositional loss. The infrastructure implied by this level of commerce, though far less elaborate than later Roman roads and facilities, must have included route marking, seasonal timing knowledge, and probably networks of guides and porters who specialized in mountain transit, creating service economies in alpine regions based on facilitating trade between lowland regions on opposite sides of the mountains. The technological revolution in archaeological surveying and documentation has dramatically enhanced the ability of researchers to locate, map, and analyze alpine glacial sites, transforming what was once a largely opportunistic and reactive process dependent on chance discoveries into a systematic program capable of predicting where artifacts are likely to appear and monitoring large areas for emerging archaeological materials. Satellite imagery, available with increasingly high resolution and frequency through both government space programs and commercial providers, allows archaeologists to track glacial retreat in near real time, identifying areas where ice has recently disappeared and prioritizing them for ground surveys before artifacts are exposed to destructive environmental forces. The satellites capture imagery in multiple spectral bands beyond visible light, including infrared and ultraviolet wavelengths that can reveal features invisible to human eyes, with certain combinations of spectral bands particularly useful for distinguishing human-made objects from natural stones and vegetation based on reflectance characteristics and thermal properties. Time series analysis comparing satellite images from different dates documents the progression of ice retreat, allows calculation of retreat rates, and enables predictive modeling of where significant exposure events are likely to occur in coming seasons. Drone technology has proven particularly valuable for alpine archaeology, providing capabilities that fall between satellite overview and ground-level detail, allowing systematic survey of specific areas identified as promising through satellite analysis while covering far more terrain than archaeologists could examine on foot. Modern drones equipped with high-resolution cameras, GPS positioning, and stabilization systems can fly pre-programmed routes along mountain passes and glacier margins, capturing overlapping images that software processes into detailed three-dimensional models showing terrain with centimeter-level precision. These photogrammetric models allow virtual inspection of sites from any angle, measurement of features without physical contact, and detection of anomalies that might represent archaeological materials based on size, shape, color, or spatial patterns. Some drones carry multispectral or thermal cameras that reveal temperature differences and material properties distinguishing artifacts from natural objects, with algorithms increasingly capable of automatically flagging potential archaeological features for human review, reducing the hours required for manual image inspection while improving detection rates for subtle or partially buried objects. Ground-penetrating radar, adapted for use in glacial environments, can detect objects still buried under several meters of snow or ice, allowing archaeologists to look ahead at what will emerge as retreat continues and to prioritize areas for intensive monitoring. The radar systems transmit electromagnetic pulses into ice and analyze reflected signals to create subsurface profiles showing boundaries between different materials, with targets like wood, metal, or stone producing distinctive signatures that trained interpreters can identify. Portable radar units that researchers can carry to remote sites provide immediate feedback about subsurface contents, guiding decisions about where to focus excavation efforts and whether observed surface artifacts are isolated finds or parts of larger deposits that warrant more extensive investigation. The challenge with ground-penetrating radar in glacial contexts is distinguishing archaeological materials from the many natural features like rock inclusions, meltwater channels, and density variations in ice that also produce radar reflections, requiring experience and often ground truthing through test excavations to calibrate interpretations and develop confidence in predictions. Laser scanning technology, deployed from aircraft or ground-based platforms, creates extraordinarily detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain showing every rock, depression, and vegetation patch with precision measured in centimeters, enabling detection of subtle features that might indicate human activity. LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, works by emitting millions of laser pulses and measuring the time required for reflected light to return, calculating distances to every point in the surveyed area and building point cloud datasets containing billions of individual measurements. When LiDAR is flown over glacial margins and recently deglaciated terrain, it can reveal artifact scatters, structural remains like stone walls or shelters, and even ancient footpaths worn into bedrock that would be invisible to observers on the ground but show clearly when elevation data is processed to emphasize subtle variations. The technology is particularly valuable for detecting features obscured by vegetation, as LiDAR pulses penetrate between leaves and branches to record ground surface beneath, essentially removing visual obstacles that hamper conventional aerial photography. The integration of these various remote sensing technologies creates layered datasets that researchers can analyze together, comparing information from different sources to build comprehensive understandings of sites before ever visiting them physically. Geographic Information Systems software allows overlay of satellite imagery, drone photography, radar profiles, and LiDAR elevation data, along with historical maps, climate records, and databases of previous archaeological finds, creating analytical environments where patterns become visible that would be impossible to detect examining any single data source alone. Archaeologists can identify correlations between artifact locations and topographic features like elevation bands, slope aspects, or proximity to water sources, testing hypotheses about site selection and route preferences through spatial analysis of hundreds or thousands of find locations. The predictive models developed from these analyses guide survey strategies, allowing efficient use of limited field time by focusing effort on areas where probability of discoveries is highest based on where similar materials have been found previously. The cutting-edge analytical techniques being applied to artifacts from alpine ice extend beyond archaeological questions to encompass climate science, environmental history, and ecosystem dynamics, as the same glacial deposits preserving cultural materials also contain pollen, plant macrofossils, insect remains, and other biological indicators that document environmental conditions during the periods when artifacts were deposited. The ice itself serves as an archive of atmospheric composition through trapped air bubbles, of temperature through oxygen isotope ratios in frozen water molecules, and of pollution events through chemical analysis of dust and particulates, creating climate records that can be precisely correlated with archaeological chronologies through radiocarbon dating of organic materials. This correlation allows unprecedented precision in understanding relationships between human activities and environmental conditions, documenting whether particular passes were used more heavily during warm periods when crossing was easier or during cold periods when lowland routes might have been less attractive, whether climate shifts triggered changes in trade patterns or population movements, and how human societies adapted to environmental variations that our modern world might face as contemporary climate change unfolds. Ancient DNA analysis, a technique that has revolutionized archaeology and paleontology over the past 2 decades, finds ideal applications in glacial contexts where cold conditions preserve genetic material that degrades rapidly in warmer environments. Researchers extracting DNA from leather artifacts can identify not just the species of animal used but sometimes the specific populations or breeds, tracing domestic animal genetics through time and revealing patterns of animal husbandry, trade in livestock, and genetic selection by ancient herders. Human DNA from remains like Otzi provides information about population genetics, migration patterns, disease histories, and even physical characteristics like eye and hair color that can be predicted from genetic sequences. Environmental DNA recovered from ice, from soil exposed by glacial retreat, and from organic deposits reveals entire ecosystems, identifying plant and animal species present during different periods and documenting ecological changes responding to climate variations and human impacts. These genetic datasets, combined with traditional archaeological evidence, create multidimensional reconstructions of past environments and human interactions with them. Isotope analysis employing multiple elements provides complementary information about ancient diets, geographic origins, and environmental conditions through examination of chemical signatures preserved in bones, teeth, and organic remains. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes reveal dietary patterns, distinguishing between terrestrial and marine food sources, between plant-based and animal-based diets, and sometimes identifying consumption of specific crops or animals through characteristic isotopic ratios. Strontium isotopes absorbed from food and water vary by geographic region depending on local geology, creating signatures that persist in tooth enamel formed during childhood and allowing researchers to identify where individuals grew up even if they died far from home. Oxygen isotopes record temperature and precipitation patterns during the period when biological tissues formed, documenting climate conditions experienced by ancient peoples and animals. Lead isotopes can source metal artifacts to specific mining regions, as different ore deposits have distinctive isotopic signatures resulting from radioactive decay over geological time scales, enabling reconstruction of Bronze Age trade networks through chemical fingerprinting of copper and bronze objects. The scientific investigation of adhesives and composite materials found in artifacts from alpine ice reveals sophisticated chemical knowledge among prehistoric craftspeople, who created glues, resins, and binders from natural materials through processes requiring careful preparation and understanding of material properties. Birch bark tar, found extensively in Copper Age and Bronze Age contexts including on Otz's equipment, required heating birch bark in oxygen-limited conditions to drive off volatile compounds and leave behind sticky resinous substances, a process that produces temperatures high enough to be dangerous and requires careful control to avoid combustion or production of useless charred material instead of functional adhesive. The fact that prehistoric peoples routinely produced this material demonstrates experimental knowledge and probably specialized craft expertise, as successful tar production requires understanding of fire management, material preparation, and process control that must be learned through experience and transmitted through teaching. Chemical analysis of ancient birch tar samples reveals variations in composition suggesting different production methods were used in different regions or time periods, with some samples showing evidence of additives mixed with pure tar to modify properties for specific applications. Other adhesives identified in alpine archaeological contexts include plant resins collected from coniferous trees, beeswax used alone or mixed with other materials, and various organic binders whose exact compositions remain uncertain but that clearly serve to attach components and seal joints in composite artifacts. The use of multiple different adhesives, sometimes in single objects, demonstrates that ancient craftspeople understood that different materials had different properties suited to different applications, selecting adhesives based on required characteristics like setting speed, working temperature, flexibility after curing, water resistance, and strength. Modern experimental archaeology attempting to recreate ancient technologies has shown that these natural adhesives, when properly prepared and applied, can perform comparably to modern synthetic adhesives for many applications, providing strong durable bonds that survive decades of use under demanding conditions. The challenge for modern researchers is often identifying exactly how ancient craftspeople prepared these materials, as subtle variations in heating temperature, processing time, or material purity can dramatically affect final properties, requiring extensive experimentation to rediscover techniques that prehistoric peoples apparently mastered through accumulated experience. The textiles and cordage found in alpine ice provide rare evidence about prehistoric fiber production, spinning, weaving, and garment construction, as these organic materials rarely survive except in exceptional preservation environments like glacial ice, waterlogged deposits, or extremely dry caves. Analysis of thread structure reveals spinning techniques, documenting whether fibers were twisted clockwise or counterclockwise, how tightly yarn was spun, and whether multiple strands were plied together to create stronger cords. Weaving patterns visible in textile fragments show that Bronze Age and earlier weavers could produce fabrics ranging from simple tabby weaves with over-under interlacing of perpendicular threads, to more complex twills where thread crossings follow diagonal patterns, to elaborate damasks with figural designs woven into fabric structure. The sophistication of these textiles, produced without mechanical looms or many tools we consider essential, demonstrates highly developed manual skills and probably specialized training, with weaving representing knowledge-intensive craft work that required years to master. The evidence for garment construction and tailoring visible in clothing fragments from alpine ice shows that prehistoric peoples did not simply wrap themselves in crude skins or roughly woven fabrics but created carefully designed fitted garments that provided effective protection while allowing freedom of movement. Otz's coat, leggings, and shoes all show evidence of careful pattern cutting, precise stitching, and attention to details like reinforcement at stress points, adjustment mechanisms to accommodate different body sizes or changing conditions, and combinations of different materials chosen for their specific properties and positioned where those properties were most beneficial. The presence of repair patches and evidence of modification indicates that clothing was valuable enough to maintain and reuse over extended periods, with worn or damaged sections replaced rather than discarding entire garments, a pattern of material economy that contrasts sharply with modern disposable fashion but makes perfect sense in contexts where producing clothing required hundreds of hours of labor to process raw materials, spin thread, weave fabric, and construct finished items. The wooden artifacts emerging from alpine ice span a remarkable functional range from simple walking sticks to sophisticated composite tools, revealing prehistoric woodworking capabilities that often surprise modern observers accustomed to assuming primitive technology among ancient peoples. The selection of appropriate wood species for different applications demonstrates ecological knowledge and understanding of material properties, with hard, dense woods chosen for applications requiring strength and impact resistance, flexible, resilient woods selected for items needing spring and shock absorption, and rot-resistant species preferred for items exposed to moisture. The tools used to work wood, primarily stone axes and adzes supplemented by bronze blades where metal was available, left characteristic cut marks and surface textures that modern analysts can read to understand construction sequences and manufacturing techniques. Some wooden artifacts show evidence of sophisticated joinery including carved mortise and tenon joints, carved threads for screwed connections, and wooden pegs or dowels securing components, techniques requiring precise measurement, careful cutting, and understanding of wood grain orientation to create joints that remain tight as wood ages and dimensions change slightly with moisture variations. The arrows found with Otzi and in other alpine contexts represent particularly complex wooden artifacts requiring multiple components precisely fitted and aligned to create functional projectiles capable of accurate flight over distances sufficient for hunting or warfare. The wooden shafts must be straight, uniform in diameter, properly weighted to balance with attached points, and finished smooth enough that they do not catch on bow or damage hands during use. The nocks cut into rear ends of shafts to accept bowstrings must be precisely positioned and sized, neither so tight that arrows bind on strings nor so loose that they fail to stay properly seated during draw and release. The fletching attachment, using adhesive and thread binding to secure feathers in positions that provide aerodynamic stability, requires understanding of how projectiles behave in flight and how different feather configurations affect trajectory and accuracy. The fact that Bronze Age and Copper Age hunters successfully created such sophisticated projectiles using simple hand tools and natural materials testifies to accumulated knowledge refined over generations of use and experimentation. The bows themselves, where preserved examples survive, represent engineering achievements that approach theoretical performance limits for designs based on wood elasticity and muscle-powered operation. Wood, preferred throughout European prehistory and continuing into medieval times for bow construction, offers optimal combinations of compression and tension strength in its contrasting heartwood and sapwood, allowing bow limbs to bend dramatically without breaking and to release stored energy efficiently. The shaping of bow limbs to achieve proper draw weight, meaning the force required to pull the string to full draw, while maintaining smooth draw characteristics without excessive hand shock or vibration, requires subtle understanding of how taper, width, and thickness variations affect bending behavior. Archaeological bows often show evidence of careful tillering, the process of progressively removing wood from limbs while testing how they bend, gradually adjusting thickness and width distributions to achieve even bending and optimal performance. Modern bowyers attempting to recreate ancient designs using traditional materials and tools report that producing functional bows requires considerable skill and experience, with many early attempts resulting in failure through limb breakage or poor performance before craftspeople develop the judgment needed to successfully produce working weapons. The specific mountain passes emerging from retreating ice as potential sites of ancient human activity represent a fascinating mosaic of different elevations, orientations, and geographic positions that collectively illustrate the complexity of prehistoric alpine travel and the multiple factors influencing route selection across different periods and purposes. The Schneidjoch Pass, situated at 2,756 meters elevation in the Bernese Alps of Switzerland, has proven particularly rich in archaeological discoveries spanning from the Neolithic period around 2800 BCE through Roman times and into the medieval era, with artifacts documenting nearly continuous use across more than 4,000 years. The pass connects the Rhone Valley with the Bernese Oberland, providing a relatively direct route between regions that would otherwise require much longer travel through lower valleys, and its moderate elevation meant it was accessible for substantial portions of each year, making it attractive for regular traffic despite the challenges of high-altitude crossing. Archaeological work at Schneidjoch has recovered hundreds of artifacts including leather shoes, textile fragments, wooden tools, bronze and iron weapons, Roman coins, and medieval equipment, creating an unparalleled chronological sequence that documents changing patterns of mountain use responding to climate variations, political developments, and economic transformations. The artifacts from Schneidjoch reveal distinct pulses of intensive use alternating with periods of apparent abandonment or reduced traffic, patterns that correlate remarkably well with paleoclimate data documenting temperature fluctuations over the same time span. During warm periods when glacier retreated and high passes became more easily accessible, artifact deposition rates increased dramatically, suggesting that travelers took advantage of favorable conditions to use the most direct routes regardless of their high elevations. During cold periods when advancing ice and increased snowfall made high passes more dangerous and less reliably passable, artifact deposition declined sharply, indicating that traffic shifted to lower routes or that overall transalpine movement decreased as deteriorating conditions made travel more difficult and risky. This correlation between climate and human activity visible in the archaeological record provides powerful evidence for how prehistoric and historic peoples adapted their behaviors to environmental conditions, choosing routes and timing travel to match seasonal and longer-term climate patterns, demonstrating considerable flexibility and sophisticated understanding of mountain environments. The preservation conditions at Schneidjoch have been particularly favorable for organic materials, with many artifacts emerging from ice in remarkable states of completeness, including leather shoes that retain stitching, straps, and structural details allowing precise reconstruction of ancient footwear design. Analysis of these shoes reveals that prehistoric alpine travelers wore surprisingly sophisticated footwear specifically adapted for mountain conditions, with designs that provided ankle support, water resistance, and traction on varied terrain through careful selection of materials and construction techniques passed down through generations. The shoes show regional and temporal variations in style and construction that serve as cultural markers, allowing archaeologists to identify probable origins of travelers and to trace influences and connections between communities on opposite sides of the mountains. Some shoes show extensive wear, indicating they carried their owners over hundreds of kilometers before being lost at high passes, perhaps worn to destruction during difficult crossings and abandoned when they could no longer protect feet adequately, their owners presumably carrying spare footwear or improvising replacements from available materials. The weapons found at Schneidjoch and similar passes illuminate the ever-present dangers of mountain travel and the necessity of being prepared for both animal threats and potential human violence, with travelers routinely carrying arms sufficient for self-defense even during apparently peaceful periods. Bronze Age daggers and spearheads, Roman swords and javelins, medieval arrows and crossbow bolts all document the continuation of armed travel across thousands of years, suggesting that mountain passes, despite or perhaps because of their remoteness, were places where travelers felt vulnerable and needed protection. Some weapons show evidence of combat use through damage patterns indicating impacts against hard targets, possible blood residue preserved in crevices, or repairs following battlefield damage, suggesting they were not merely carried for deterrence but actually employed in violent encounters. The discovery of isolated weapons, sometimes accompanied by remains of pack animals or evidence of hastily abandoned camps, hints at ambushes, robberies, or battles that left casualties in remote locations where bodies and equipment might lie undiscovered for centuries or millennia until ice retreat exposed them. The San Bernardino Pass, at 2,065 meters, one of the lower major alpine crossings, nevertheless shows evidence of human use extending back into prehistory despite the availability of even lower routes nearby, suggesting that factors beyond simple elevation influence route selection. The pass provides relatively gentle gradients and wide valleys approaching from both sides, making it suitable for moving large groups with pack animals and wheeled vehicles, advantages that apparently outweighed the existence of technically lower passes that were steeper or more confined. Roman development of the San Bernardino was extensive, with substantial road construction, way stations, and military posts documenting its strategic importance, and the pass continued as a major route through medieval and modern times, eventually becoming a modern highway corridor still serving as a crucial link between northern and southern Europe. Archaeological work in recently deglaciated areas adjacent to the main pass has revealed evidence of prehistoric use, including Bronze Age artifacts and possible structural remains, suggesting that even before Roman engineering created the formal road, travelers were using this natural corridor and that knowledge of its advantages was transmitted across cultural and temporal boundaries. The Col de la Traversette, already mentioned in connection with Hannibal's possible crossing route, represents the opposite extreme of alpine passes, at over 3,000 meters elevation and with approaches involving steep rocky terrain that would challenge even experienced modern mountaineers carrying minimal gear, yet apparently seeing enough ancient traffic to leave detectable archaeological traces. The organic deposits and artifacts from this area suggest that some travelers, whether driven by necessity, pursuing tactical advantages, or simply preferring to minimize travel distance regardless of difficulty, were willing to accept extraordinary hardship and risk to cross the Alps by the most direct routes available. The presence of military-related artifacts and the organic deposits possibly connected to Hannibal's army indicate that strategic considerations could outweigh purely practical ones, with commanders accepting high casualties and equipment losses in exchange for achieving surprise or reaching objectives before enemies could respond. The pass also appears to have seen some use during other periods, suggesting it was not solely a one-time military route but occasionally served civilian purposes when conditions were particularly favorable or when other passes were blocked or threatened. The Little St. Bernard Pass and Great St. Bernard Pass, already discussed in the context of Roman infrastructure, show archaeological evidence of pre-Roman use extending back into the Bronze Age and probably earlier, with finds suggesting these natural corridors attracted human traffic long before formal roads enhanced their accessibility. The concentration of votive offerings at both passes, including Bronze Age figurines and weapons apparently deliberately deposited as offerings to mountain deities, indicates these locations held religious or spiritual significance beyond their practical importance as travel routes. The offerings suggest that ancient travelers, like their Roman successors, engaged in ritual practices before attempting crossings, perhaps seeking divine protection or giving thanks for successful journeys, or possibly propitiating dangerous supernatural forces believed to control mountain weather and protect or threaten those who dared enter high places. The continuity of sacred associations at these passes from prehistoric through Roman and into Christian medieval periods, when hospices maintained by religious orders continued traditions of assisting travelers, demonstrates remarkable persistence of cultural meanings attached to specific landscapes despite dramatic changes in religious beliefs and social organizations. The Theodule Pass, connecting Zermatt in Switzerland with the Italian valley below the Matterhorn, provides evidence for prehistoric crossing routes at extreme elevations approaching 3,300 meters, higher than any point in the Alps outside the immediate vicinity of the highest peaks. The pass sees minimal modern use, having been superseded by lower routes and by tunnels and cable cars that bypass mountain passes entirely, but glacial retreat has revealed artifacts including Bronze Age weapons and tools that document ancient traffic through this formidable terrain. The presence of such finds at such elevations challenges assumptions about ancient altitude tolerance and willingness to accept risk, suggesting either that Bronze Age travelers were extraordinarily hardy and skilled, or that climate conditions during certain periods made these crossings less dangerous than they would be today, or possibly both factors contributed to what now seems like remarkably bold mountain travel. The artifacts themselves provide few clues about who was crossing at such elevations or why, but the most likely explanations involve either herders moving livestock to high summer pastures and crossing passes as shortcuts between grazing areas, or traders willing to accept difficult routes to save time and distance between markets. The distribution of archaeological sites across the Alps reveals patterns that illuminate ancient understandings of mountain geography and route planning, with major concentrations of finds occurring at specific passes while other apparently similar locations yield few or no artifacts, suggesting that route selection was not random but reflected accumulated knowledge about which corridors offered optimal combinations of accessibility, directness, and safety. Some patterns are obvious, with passes on direct lines between major valleys showing heavy use while circuitous routes were avoided, but other patterns are less immediately explicable, with some passes that seem difficult and dangerous showing evidence of sustained traffic while apparently easier alternatives nearby were less used. These puzzling distributions probably reflect factors that archaeological evidence alone cannot fully reveal, including political boundaries that made certain routes preferable even if more difficult, traditional grazing territories that channeled herder movements along specific paths, or spiritual associations that made particular passes culturally significant regardless of practical considerations. Understanding these patterns requires integrating archaeological evidence with historical texts, ethnographic parallels from other mountain regions, and paleo-environmental data about past climate and vegetation zones. The seasonal timing of ancient alpine travel emerges from multiple lines of evidence including pollen analysis indicating what plants were blooming when artifacts were deposited, analysis of preserved food remains showing what seasonal foods were being consumed, and practical considerations about when high passes would have been accessible given reconstructed climate conditions. The general pattern shows that most transalpine travel occurred during summer months from roughly June through September when snow cover at high elevations was minimal and when weather conditions were most favorable, though the precise timing varied with elevation and with year-to-year climate variations. However, some evidence suggests that determined travelers crossed mountains during other seasons when necessary, accepting greater risks and hardships when circumstances demanded, with occasional finds of winter equipment like snowshoes or heavy cold-weather clothing indicating that at least some people were prepared for and capable of winter mountain travel. The presence of Roman military equipment at high passes during seasons when conditions would have been severe demonstrates that armies sometimes moved through the Alps during autumn, winter, or early spring, probably because military necessities overrode considerations of safety and comfort that would govern civilian travel. The animals that accompanied ancient travelers through alpine passes included horses, mules, donkeys, cattle, sheep, goats, and dogs, with different species serving different purposes and showing different capabilities for mountain travel under various conditions. Horse remains from high-altitude sites indicate that cavalry units and mounted travelers crossed the Alps regularly despite the difficulties of managing large animals on narrow mountain paths, presumably because the speed and cargo capacity advantages of horses outweighed the challenges of feeding and controlling them in mountain environments. Mules and donkeys, particularly valued as pack animals because of their sure-footedness and ability to navigate difficult terrain while carrying substantial loads, appear in archaeological contexts through equipment like pack saddles and through skeletal remains showing characteristic bone modifications from lifetime use as working animals. Cattle bones at high passes might represent animals being driven to market, transhumant herding moving livestock to seasonal pastures, or possibly provisions accompanying large groups like armies that needed substantial food supplies. Sheep and goats, naturally adapted to mountain environments and capable of grazing on high-altitude vegetation, probably moved through passes primarily as part of transhumant systems where herders seasonally relocated flocks between lowland winter pastures and high summer grazing areas. Dogs accompanied mountain travelers as protection against predators, assistance in managing livestock, and companionship during long journeys through lonely terrain, with skeletal remains at high-altitude sites and artistic depictions in Roman and medieval sources confirming their presence. The specific breeds used for alpine travel are difficult to determine from fragmentary remains, but they were probably similar to modern mountain dog breeds like St. Bernard's and Bernese mountain dogs, large powerful animals capable of breaking trail through snow, carrying packs, locating and rescuing lost or injured travelers, and providing warmth during cold nights when they slept near or even with their human companions. The famous rescue dogs of the medieval hospices, who carried supplies around their necks and were trained to locate travelers in distress, represented a formalization and specialization of roles that dogs had probably filled informally throughout the long history of alpine crossing. The emotional bonds between travelers and their animal companions, difficult to document archaeologically but occasionally hinted at through care taken in burying animals and through historical accounts describing grief at loss of valued horses or dogs, remind us that ancient journeys involved not just human participants but whole communities of different species cooperating to achieve shared goals of crossing mountains and reaching distant destinations. The scientific and cultural significance of the discoveries emerging from alpine ice extends far beyond the immediate archaeological value of individual artifacts, fundamentally reshaping our understanding of prehistoric and ancient European societies, their capabilities, their interconnections, and their responses to environmental changes that parallel challenges facing our contemporary world. The cumulative picture built from thousands of artifacts spanning millennia reveals populations that were far more mobile, technologically sophisticated, and economically integrated than conventional models of ancient life had suggested, challenging persistent assumptions about primitive simplicity and isolation that have long colored popular and even scholarly perceptions of peoples lacking written records or certain technologies we consider fundamental to civilization. The evidence forces recognition that human ingenuity, adaptability, and social complexity do not require modern technology or urban civilization, and that peoples we might patronizingly label as primitive were actually highly capable problem solvers who successfully navigated environmental and social challenges comparable in complexity to those we face today, doing so with knowledge systems and technologies precisely adapted to their circumstances and often remarkably effective by any objective measure. The insights into ancient migration patterns and cultural connections that glacial archaeology provides illuminate fundamental questions about European population history, the spread of languages and cultural practices, and the mechanisms by which innovations diffused across vast distances in pre-modern times when communication and travel were supposedly limited. The presence of artifacts from distant regions at alpine passes documents not just trade in objects but implies personal movement of individuals carrying goods, knowledge, and genetic material between communities separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometers, creating networks of exchange that connected the Mediterranean with northern Europe, the Atlantic coast with the Balkans, and everything in between. These connections facilitated not just economic exchange but cultural borrowing, technological diffusion, and probably political relationships including alliances, marriages between elite families, and military cooperation or conflict, all mediated through the difficult but clearly surmountable barrier of the Alps. The specific artifacts found in glacial contexts often represent the material culture of travelers rather than sedentary populations, providing rare evidence about people in motion rather than the settled communities that dominate conventional archaeological records based on excavation of habitation sites. The evidence for technological knowledge and craft specialization visible in artifacts from alpine ice demonstrates that prehistoric societies supported specialists who devoted substantial time to perfecting particular skills rather than everyone being generalist subsistence producers, implying social organizations capable of generating surplus production sufficient to support non-food producing artisans and economic systems that facilitated exchange of specialized products across distances. The sophistication of metallurgy visible in Bronze Age artifacts, the quality of textile production documented by preserved fabrics, the skill evident in leather working and woodworking, and the precise manufacture of composite tools all require years of training and regular practice to master, suggesting existence of apprenticeship systems, craft guilds, or family traditions that transmitted specialized knowledge across generations. The presence of such highly crafted objects at mountain passes indicates that valuable specialized products were important components of transalpine trade, with finished goods moving between production centers and distant markets, carrying with them not just material value but information about techniques and styles that could influence craft traditions in receiving regions. The relationship between human activity in the Alps and climate change over millennia provides historical perspective on contemporary global warming and its impacts on mountain environments, human societies, and cultural heritage, though drawing direct parallels requires caution given substantial differences between gradual natural climate variations of the past and rapid anthropogenic warming of the present. The archaeological evidence documents that prehistoric and ancient peoples adapted to climate variations through adjusting settlement locations, modifying subsistence strategies, shifting trade routes as some passes became more or less accessible, and probably experiencing population pressures and conflicts when climate deterioration reduced productive capacities of agricultural lands. These adaptations were not always smooth or painless, with evidence suggesting that some climate transitions triggered social disruptions, migrations, and collapses of existing political structures, though causation is complex and climate was always one factor among many influencing social change. The warm period during Roman times that made high alpine passes more accessible probably contributed to Roman success in controlling transalpine trade and communications, while subsequent cooling during late antiquity and the early medieval period that caused glacier advances and made high routes more difficult may have contributed to disruption of Roman infrastructure and helped enable the political fragmentation that followed Rome's collapse. The contemporary glacier retreat that is revealing these archaeological treasures is occurring at rates far exceeding any documented in the geological record for at least the past 10,000 years, driven by anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions that have fundamentally altered Earth's energy balance and committed the planet to continued warming for decades or centuries regardless of emissions reductions that might be achieved going forward. The archaeological implications of this unprecedented rapid deglaciation are profound and troubling, as thousands of years of accumulated artifacts are being exposed simultaneously across vast areas, creating documentation and preservation challenges that overwhelm available resources and guarantee that substantial amounts of invaluable evidence will be lost before it can be recorded or recovered. The archaeological crisis is minor compared to broader environmental and social impacts of climate change, but it serves as a tangible visible reminder of how rapidly human actions are transforming planetary systems and how difficult it is to respond effectively even when problems are clearly recognized and solutions are technically feasible. The race to document alpine archaeology before it disappears mirrors larger struggles to preserve biodiversity before species go extinct, to protect coastal communities before rising seas inundate them, and to adapt food production systems before changing climate patterns devastate agriculture. The efforts by Swiss and Italian authorities to systematically survey, document, and preserve archaeological materials emerging from ice represent best practices in heritage management under crisis conditions, but even these well-funded, well-organized programs acknowledge they can save only a fraction of what is being revealed, with many artifacts certainly disappearing unrecorded and with difficult decisions required about how to allocate limited resources among competing priorities. The programs have achieved remarkable successes in recovering and preserving thousands of artifacts, in documenting dozens of significant sites, and in engaging public support through education programs that help citizens understand the value of glacial archaeology and the importance of reporting finds rather than collecting them as personal souvenirs. However, program managers readily admit that vast areas of recently deglaciated terrain receive minimal or no systematic survey, that reported finds often cannot be investigated promptly, and that artifacts known to be deteriorating in place sometimes cannot be recovered because resources are committed elsewhere, forcing agonizing choices about what can be saved and what must be sacrificed. These resource constraints reflect broader societal decisions about funding for cultural heritage protection, with archaeology competing against many other public priorities in contexts of limited budgets and political pressures to demonstrate immediate practical benefits from public expenditures. The question of what to do with artifacts once they are recovered presents its own challenges, as proper conservation requires specialized facilities and expertise that are expensive to establish and maintain, while storage of growing collections strains capacity of existing museums and repositories. Some artifacts require constant environmental control to prevent deterioration, essentially meaning they must remain in cold storage indefinitely, raising questions about access for research and public display when keeping materials viewable means accepting increased deterioration rates. The costs of proper conservation often exceed the costs of field recovery, creating situations where artifacts are rescued from immediate destruction but then languish in inadequate storage because funds are unavailable for proper treatment, a particularly frustrating outcome that undermines the justification for rescue efforts. The tension between preserving artifacts for future study and making them accessible for current research and education has no perfect resolution, with every decision involving trade-offs between competing values and interests, complicated by uncertainty about what future technologies might enable and what questions future researchers might ask that we cannot anticipate. The cultural heritage implications of glacial archaeology extend beyond academic research to encompass issues of identity, memory, and connection to landscapes and histories that shape how communities understand themselves and their relationships to places they inhabit. For alpine communities, the artifacts emerging from ice connect contemporary populations to ancestors who lived in the same valleys, crossed the same passes, and dealt with many of the same environmental challenges that current residents face, creating tangible links across millennia that can foster sense of continuity and rootedness. The discoveries also attract tourism and media attention that brings economic benefits and raises profiles of mountain regions that often struggle economically as traditional activities like agriculture and resource extraction become less viable. However, tourism driven by archaeological interest can create pressures on fragile sites, with visitors inadvertently damaging resources or disturbing contexts, requiring management strategies that balance access against preservation and that educate visitors about proper behavior in archaeologically sensitive areas. The international dimensions of alpine glacial archaeology involve both cooperation and occasional tensions, as sites often straddle political boundaries and artifacts sometimes raise questions about which country has jurisdiction and ownership rights. The case of Otzi, found essentially on the border between Austria and Italy with initial confusion about which side he was actually on, illustrated how archaeological discoveries can trigger diplomatic discussions and require negotiated solutions. Generally, Switzerland, Italy, Austria, France, and other alpine nations have maintained good cooperation on glacial archaeology, sharing information, coordinating programs, and recognizing that the scientific and cultural value of discoveries transcends national boundaries even while respecting legal frameworks that assign jurisdiction based on find locations. The collaborative spirit reflects broader European integration and scientific internationalism, but also pragmatic recognition that many sites and artifact distribution span multiple countries and that effective research requires cross-border cooperation. The establishment of international research consortia, shared databases, and joint funding initiatives demonstrates how archaeology can serve as an arena for positive international engagement around shared heritage and mutual interests. The role of citizen science in alpine glacial archaeology has been crucial, with many significant discoveries resulting from reports by hikers, climbers, and other mountain users who encountered artifacts and recognized their potential importance. The Swiss and Italian programs have invested substantially in public education and outreach, training mountain guides and tourism operators to recognize archaeological materials, establishing reporting systems that make it easy for citizens to communicate discoveries, and creating feedback mechanisms that let finders learn about significance of objects they reported and results of subsequent investigations. This engagement with public communities has generated goodwill and support for archaeological programs while multiplying the surveillance capacity beyond what professional archaeologists alone could achieve. The approach recognizes that effective heritage protection in mountain environments requires partnership with people who live and work in those landscapes rather than treating conservation as exclusively the province of outside experts who arrive periodically to conduct surveys and remove artifacts. The balance between encouraging citizen involvement and preventing well-intentioned but damaging amateur excavation requires clear communication about what actions are helpful versus harmful, with messages emphasizing the importance of reporting finds without disturbing them and leaving recovery to trained personnel. The educational programs built around alpine glacial archaeology reach diverse audiences, from school children learning about local history and climate change to university students conducting specialized research to general public interested in how science reconstructs past lives from fragmentary evidence. Museum exhibitions featuring artifacts from ice attract large audiences and generate substantial media coverage, creating opportunities to communicate not just about specific discoveries but about broader themes including human adaptability, the long history of European cultural connections, the importance of preserving heritage, and the reality of climate change documented through multiple independent lines of evidence. The artifacts themselves, particularly organic materials that are rarely preserved in conventional archaeological sites, have visceral impact on viewers who can see actual leather shoes worn by Bronze Age travelers, actual textiles woven thousands of years ago, actual wooden tools held and used by people whose worlds were radically different from ours yet who shared fundamental human characteristics of curiosity, ingenuity, and determination to overcome obstacles and achieve goals. These tangible connections to past lives can inspire a sense of shared humanity across time and can make abstract historical periods concrete and emotionally resonant in ways that no amount of text or even images can match. The future trajectory of alpine glacial archaeology depends on multiple factors including the pace of continued climate change, funding levels for heritage programs, development of new technologies for discovery and preservation, and continued public support for investing resources in documenting and protecting archaeological materials. Current projections suggest that glacial retreat will continue throughout this century and beyond, meaning that artifacts will continue emerging for decades at minimum, sustaining the need for active programs and creating ongoing opportunities for new discoveries. However, the rate of exposure may peak within coming decades as most accessible ice deposits disappear, after which remaining artifacts will be in progressively more difficult locations requiring greater resources to access and document. The quality of preservation may also decline as artifacts emerging from ice that has been thinning and warming for years may show greater deterioration than materials that were in stable frozen conditions until recently, potentially affecting the scientific value of later discoveries compared to earlier finds. These considerations argue for maximizing effort and investment in near-term programs while conditions remain favorable and while the greatest quantities of well-preserved materials are becoming available. The methodological innovations developed for alpine glacial archaeology have applications beyond mountain environments, with techniques and approaches pioneered for dealing with rapid artifact exposure and difficult access conditions proving relevant for other contexts including coastal erosion that exposes archaeological sites, permafrost thaw in Arctic regions revealing remains of ancient cultures, and even disaster scenarios where archaeological sites require emergency documentation before destruction by development, warfare, or natural catastrophes. The integration of remote sensing, rapid assessment protocols, prioritization systems, and collaborative networks with citizen observers creates a model for managing heritage under crisis conditions that could be adapted to various situations where time pressure and resource limitations require efficient focused intervention. The conservation techniques developed for artifacts emerging from ice, particularly for organic materials that are waterlogged and fragile, contribute to broader preservation science and benefit museums and conservation facilities dealing with similar materials from other sources. The trajectory of alpine glacial archaeology over the coming decades presents both extraordinary opportunities and sobering challenges, as accelerating ice loss guarantees continued revelations about human history while simultaneously ensuring that much irreplaceable evidence will be lost before it can be documented, creating a bittersweet situation where scientific discoveries are inseparable from environmental destruction that makes those discoveries possible. The melting of alpine glacier represents just one manifestation of global climate change that is transforming landscapes, ecosystems, and human communities worldwide, with mountain regions particularly vulnerable to warming that occurs at rates exceeding global averages and that triggers cascading effects including altered precipitation patterns, changed vegetation zones, modified stream flows, increased natural hazard frequencies, and disruption of traditional livelihoods dependent on stable environmental conditions. The archaeological materials emerging from ice serve as tangible reminders of how profoundly human actions are reshaping the planet, providing evidence that the landscapes we imagine as eternal and unchanging are actually dynamic and responsive to climate variations that our industrial civilization has amplified to unprecedented levels through greenhouse gas emissions that have altered atmospheric composition more rapidly than at any point in the geological record excluding catastrophic events like asteroid impacts. The predictions for future glacial retreat in the Alps, based on climate models incorporating various scenarios for greenhouse gas emissions and temperature increases, suggest that most alpine glacier will disappear entirely by the end of this century if current warming trends continue, with only the largest ice masses at the highest elevations potentially surviving in reduced form. This complete deglaciation would expose the full extent of accumulated archaeological deposits from thousands of years of human activity, creating a brief window during which materials would be accessible before erosion, vegetation growth, and other processes obscure or destroy evidence. The archaeological community faces the reality that this window is already open and closing, with every passing year seeing both new discoveries and irreversible losses, and that even heroic efforts to document and preserve materials can save only a fraction of what exists. The scale of the challenge would require resources far exceeding what any nation or international organization is likely to allocate to archaeological heritage protection, forcing acceptance that most of what is being revealed will be lost without record, that many sites will never be investigated, and that future generations will judge harshly the decisions and priorities that allowed this destruction of irreplaceable evidence about human history. The philosophical questions about heritage preservation in an era of rapid environmental change extend beyond practical concerns about funding and logistics to fundamental issues about what we value, what we choose to protect, and how we balance competing priorities in contexts of constrained resources and multiple urgent demands. Archaeological materials have no immediate practical utility in the sense that losing them does not directly threaten lives or livelihoods the way that climate impacts on food production, water supplies, or coastal communities do, yet they represent unique, irreplaceable records of human experience and cultural achievement that once lost can never be recovered or reconstructed. The case for investing substantial resources in archaeological preservation rests on arguments about cultural heritage as a public good, about the value of understanding our collective past for navigating our shared future, about identity and memory as components of human well-being that deserve protection alongside material needs, and about obligations to future generations who will inherit whatever world we leave them and who will want to understand how humanity arrived at whatever situation they face. These arguments resonate with many people but compete against immediate pressing needs that have more direct and visible impacts, creating political and social challenges in mobilizing support for heritage protection. The lessons that contemporary societies might learn from the evidence of ancient adaptation to climate change emerging from alpine ice are complex and require careful interpretation that avoids both uncritical presentism that projects modern concerns onto past peoples who faced different circumstances, and romantic primitivism that imagines ancient solutions as templates applicable to modern problems without accounting for fundamental differences in scale, technology, and social organization. The archaeological evidence demonstrates that human societies have successfully adapted to substantial climate variations in the past, adjusting settlement patterns, subsistence strategies, and social organizations to maintain viability under changing conditions, which might seem encouraging for our ability to adapt to contemporary climate change. However, the evidence also documents that adaptation was often traumatic and costly, involving population dislocations, social conflicts, collapse of existing political structures, and abandonment of once prosperous regions, suggesting that successful adaptation from the perspective of species or civilization survival may involve catastrophic disruption and suffering for individuals and communities who bear the costs of transition. The scale of contemporary climate change, the size of human populations potentially affected, and the interconnectedness of modern global systems all mean that adaptation will be far more complex and potentially more difficult than anything ancient peoples faced. The specific evidence about prehistoric and ancient use of alpine passes under different climate regimes shows that warming generally increased transalpine traffic by making high routes more accessible and extending the seasonal windows when crossings were feasible, while cooling reduced traffic and shifted routes to lower elevations or reduced overall mobility. This pattern suggests that if the analogy holds for contemporary warming, we might expect increased accessibility and use of mountain regions, which is indeed occurring as recreation, tourism, and resource exploitation expand into areas that were previously too difficult or dangerous to access regularly. However, contemporary mountain communities face different challenges than ancient peoples did, including infrastructure developed for specific climate conditions that becomes maladaptive as those conditions change, economic dependencies on climate-sensitive activities like winter tourism that may become unviable, and natural hazard risks that increase as warming destabilizes slopes, triggers rockfalls and avalanches, and modifies hydrological patterns in ways that threaten settlements and transportation routes. The loss of glacier eliminates water sources that communities and agricultural systems depend on, creates new lakes that pose flood risks if naturally dammed by moraines fail, and removes ice masses that have historically moderated temperature extremes and precipitation patterns in mountain valleys. The cultural and spiritual dimensions of glacier loss resonate particularly strongly in alpine communities where ice has been a defining feature of landscapes for as long as anyone can remember, shaping identities, livelihoods, and relationships between people and mountains. The named glaciers that are disappearing were landmarks that organized geographic knowledge, reference points for navigation and communication, and often features with cultural meanings and stories attached to them through generations of human engagement with mountain environments. The loss of these familiar elements of landscape represents a kind of bereavement, a grief for vanishing features that connected present to past and that helped define sense of place and belonging. Some communities have held funeral ceremonies for glaciers, acknowledging their disappearance and the changes their loss represents, creating rituals that help people process emotions around environmental transformations that are beyond individual control yet profoundly affect collective experience. These responses to glacier loss illustrate how environmental changes have psychological and cultural dimensions alongside their material impacts, affecting well-being and identity in ways that are real and important even if difficult to quantify or measure. The archaeological discoveries emerging from melting ice contribute to these emotional and cultural responses in complex ways, providing both consolation and additional cause for concern. The artifacts demonstrate that mountains have always been dynamic environments experiencing climate variations and human adaptations, potentially helping contemporary communities contextualize current changes as part of longer-term processes rather than unprecedented catastrophes, though the rate and magnitude of current warming are indeed unprecedented in the archaeological and historical record. The evidence of long human presence in alpine regions connects contemporary communities to deep histories, demonstrating that these landscapes have sustained human life and culture for thousands of years through various climate regimes, potentially fostering resilience and confidence that adaptation is possible. However, the recognition that irreplaceable evidence about this long history is being lost as glacier melt adds urgency and poignancy to present circumstances, creating awareness that environmental changes have cultural costs and that what we are losing includes not just physical ice but also the historical records that ice preserved, representing both present losses and foreclosed futures where descendants will lack knowledge about their ancestors that might have been preserved if action had been taken sooner or more aggressively. The international attention focused on alpine glacial archaeology has helped raise broader awareness about climate change impacts and heritage preservation challenges, with media coverage of discoveries like Otzi and discussions of the race to document vanishing archaeological sites reaching audiences far beyond specialists and helping communicate both the reality of climate change and its diverse consequences. The visual drama of artifacts emerging from ice, the human stories reconstructed from ancient remains, and the urgency of time-limited opportunities to recover materials before they are lost forever all create compelling narratives that engage public imagination and foster understanding of complex issues. The coverage has generally been scientifically accurate while also being accessible to general audiences, avoiding both alarmism that exaggerates problems beyond what evidence supports and complacency that understates serious challenges, achieving a balance that effective science communication requires. The researchers involved in glacial archaeology have mostly been skilled communicators willing to engage with media and public, recognizing that maintaining support for their work requires explaining its value and findings to taxpayers and policymakers who fund research and preservation programs. The technological frontiers in glacial archaeology continue advancing as new tools and methods are developed specifically for the challenges of mountain environments and rapid artifact exposure, with innovations likely to accelerate discovery rates and improve preservation success in coming years even as the quantity of materials requiring attention continues growing. Machine learning algorithms trained to recognize archaeological materials in aerial imagery and drone footage show promise for automating initial survey and detection, potentially allowing rapid screening of vast areas to identify locations warranting closer investigation, though human expertise remains essential for interpreting ambiguous cases and for understanding contextual relationships that algorithms may miss. Improved DNA sequencing technologies and analytical methods extract more information from smaller samples with less degradation, allowing genetic analysis of artifacts that would have been impossible to study with earlier techniques and potentially enabling research on materials collected years ago that were preserved but not fully analyzed due to technical limitations that no longer apply. Advanced imaging systems reveal internal structures and material properties without requiring destructive sampling, using techniques like neutron radiography and advanced CT scanning that can see through dense or opaque materials to document construction details and identify components. The preservation technologies for organic materials continue improving through research into stabilization methods, storage conditions, and treatments that arrest deterioration while maintaining scientific research potential and occasionally public display possibilities. New approaches to freeze-drying and chemical stabilization show promise for treating waterlogged wood and leather more effectively than earlier methods, producing more stable materials that retain structural integrity and require less intensive ongoing environmental control. Understanding of deterioration mechanisms has advanced through study of how different conditions affect different materials, allowing better prediction of how artifacts will respond to various treatments and storage regimes and enabling more informed decisions about conservation priorities and methods. The establishment of specialized facilities for glacial archaeological materials, equipped with appropriate climate control, analytical equipment, and expertise in treating ice-preserved artifacts, has centralized resources and knowledge in ways that improve outcomes and facilitate research access, though also creating dependencies on continued funding and institutional support that could be vulnerable to political or economic changes. The collaborative networks that have developed among alpine archaeologists, conservation specialists, climate scientists, and other researchers working on glacial environments and cultural heritage have created productive interdisciplinary communities where diverse expertise contributes to more comprehensive understanding than any single discipline could achieve alone. These collaborations have generated research projects that integrate archaeological evidence with paleoclimate data, genetic analysis with historical texts, and remote sensing with traditional fieldwork, producing insights that emerge from synthesis across different kinds of evidence and analytical approaches. The networks also facilitate rapid information sharing when discoveries occur, enabling quick mobilization of appropriate expertise and resources to investigate and recover materials before opportunities are lost. International conferences, workshops, and publications bring together researchers from different countries and institutions, fostering exchange of ideas and methods while building personal relationships that support ongoing collaboration. The model of interdisciplinary cooperation developed in alpine glacial archaeology could inform other fields facing complex problems that require integration of diverse knowledge systems and collaborative approaches that transcend traditional disciplinary boundaries. The legacy that current efforts in glacial archaeology will leave for future generations depends substantially on how comprehensively documentation is conducted and how effectively information is preserved and made accessible for long-term use. Digital databases recording artifact locations, descriptions, photographs, and analytical results create permanent records that will outlast the artifacts themselves, which in many cases will eventually deteriorate despite best preservation efforts or will remain in storage rarely accessed for research or display. The development of robust database systems with appropriate metadata, standardized recording protocols, and long-term preservation strategies ensures that information remains accessible and usable as technologies change and as institutional arrangements evolve. The commitment to open access for data and publications, where feasible within constraints of protecting sensitive site locations and respecting cultural concerns, maximizes the value of research by allowing broad use of information and enabling researchers worldwide to contribute to analysis and interpretation without requiring direct access to physical materials. The challenge of digital preservation across technological generations, as storage media and file formats become obsolete, requiring ongoing migration to newer systems, necessitates dedicated resources and institutional commitment to maintaining accessibility of data over decades and centuries. The final accounting of what is saved and what is lost from alpine glacial archaeology cannot yet be made, as ice continues melting and revealing new materials while known sites continue deteriorating and documented artifacts remain at risk from inadequate preservation resources, creating a situation of ongoing triage where successes and failures accumulate simultaneously. The extraordinary achievements of researchers and heritage professionals who have recovered and preserved thousands of artifacts, documented dozens of significant sites, and generated fundamental new insights about European prehistory and ancient history deserve recognition and celebration, representing dedication, ingenuity, and scientific excellence under challenging conditions. However, the acknowledgement must also include recognition that much has been lost, that many artifacts have deteriorated or disappeared without documentation, that budget and personnel constraints have prevented investigation of many reported sites, and that the pace of glacial retreat continues accelerating beyond capacity of preservation programs to keep pace. The situation illustrates the broader challenges of responding to rapid environmental change, where even well-funded, well-organized efforts struggle to address problems at the scale and speed they are occurring, and where difficult decisions about priorities and resource allocation must be made with incomplete information and under time pressure that prevents deliberate, careful consideration. The story of the Alps melting secrets ultimately transcends archaeology and climate science to encompass fundamental questions about humanity's relationship with the past, with the environment, and with the future we are creating through our actions and choices. The Roman roads and ancient passes appearing from ice connect us tangibly to peoples who crossed these same mountains thousands of years ago, whose daily lives were unimaginably different from ours yet who shared essential human characteristics of adaptability, creativity, and determination to overcome obstacles. The evidence emerging from glacial ice reminds us that human history is far deeper and more complex than the written records that document only the most recent few thousand years, and that understanding our collective past requires engaging with material evidence that archaeology recovers and interprets. The race to document this vanishing evidence before it is lost forever illustrates the urgency of addressing climate change before irreversible damage forecloses options and destroys resources that cannot be recovered. The incomplete success of preservation efforts despite substantial investment and dedication demonstrates the magnitude of challenges we face and the difficulty of responding effectively even when problems are recognized and solutions are technically possible. As the ice continues its inexorable retreat, revealing secrets held for millennia while simultaneously consigning many of those secrets to oblivion, we are reminded that the past and future are always interconnected, that present actions have lasting consequences, and that what we choose to value and protect defines who we are as individuals and societies.